Maritime history is full of unexplained phenomenon and tall tales of sea monsters and, mariners going out and returning in different parts of the world and not knowing how they got there. You've abandoned ships. You have all these crazy things that happen out on the ocean. And many of them are just stories. We like to believe them because they're fascinating, but few of them actually hold up and are true. But one story, it is absolutely as fascinating as some of these very tall tales, but also happens to be true. Today, I'm going to cover that story, and it is the story of the lost Hawaiian fisherman. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have 5 highly experienced Hawaiian fishermen that take off on a daytime fishing trip. The weather turns really bad while they're out in the water and they don't return. Despite an extensive search effort, they are not located, and after a year, the families and friends of the lost fishermen, they host a memorial service and assume that their loved ones are gone forever. 9 years later, they make a discovery on a very small island 2,300 miles away that calls into question the entire story. It's an amazing story, it's a tragic story, but it's one worth listening to right to the very end. Before we get started, if you are into strange and mysterious stories like the one I've just described, my channel is going to be a bevy of content just like that. And so if you could gently liquidate... If you could gently liquidate... I can't even say it. If you could gently liquidate the like button... If you could gently liquidate the like button and subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. Scott Moorman was born in 1952 in the San Fernando Valley in California. At a young age, he loved the show Adventures in Paradise, which was about this crew of young sailors that would travel the South Pacific looking for adventure and passengers to pick up along the way. And it was just this brilliant show to him. And he became obsessed with living in the South Pacific when he got older. Specifically, he wanted to live in Hawaii. But that wouldn't necessarily happen right away because at a young age, he got married and had a son and stayed in California. But in 1975, he and his wife split up. And so he took that as an opportunity to go fulfill that childhood dream of living in Hawaii. And so he, on his own, his son stayed with his former wife. He, Scott, moves out to the east coast of Maui on Hawaii. And he moves into this little town called Nahiku. Now, Nahiku was full of lots of native Hawaiians and a growing population of kind of like refugees in a way, Vietnam veterans kind of that were over living in the mainland. You have hippies and kind of earth-loving people that do a lot more partying than working. They were all kind of congregating in this same town. And Scott, he loved that culture and he quickly became a part of it. But he also, unlike a lot of the kind of hippies that made their way to Nahiku, that were part of that growing population, Scott really wanted to kind of become a part of the whole culture of Nahiku because he growing up, he loved Hawaii. He didn't want to be the others on the island. He wanted to be a part of the main culture. And so he took it upon himself to learn the sort of pidgin English that locals would use. He took time to learn some of the cultural traditions that they had and really went out of his way to try to befriend some of the locals. And while he wasn't really embraced as, a kind of local, he did form a number of friendships with local Hawaiians. And in time, he really felt like this is where he belongs. This was home to him 100%. So he would only go back to California one time. He goes back once for his son's birthday, and he also sees his parents while he's there, and they are all pleading with him to come back, be with your family. They want him to stay. And he says, no, Nahiku is where I belong, and I can't envision myself living anywhere else. And so when he flies back after that one visit to California for his son's birthday, when he flies back to Nahiku, that will be the last time that his son, his former wife, and his parents, his family back in the mainland would see him. That's the last they would see him. On February 11th, 1979, Scott and 4 of his friends decide that they're not going to go to work that day. They all worked construction together. Instead, they're going to go fishing because they all love to fish and the weather was beautiful. So they said, why not? Now, none of them owned their own boat. So they had to ask a friend who had a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Their friend allowed them to use it. And so they got their boat. They went to the store, got some beer, snacks, and got some ice for their big ice chest so they could pack it with the fish they caught, that they hopefully caught. And they were on their way. The part of Hawaii that Scott and his friends lived in, the east coast of Maui, at the time did not get any TV stations, and radio broadcasts were done maybe once a week and were hard to pick up. So people in that area, especially fishermen and anybody that was out on the water, they were accustomed to going out without a weather report. They basically played the weather by their eye. They kind of just sized it up and said, does it seem okay? Okay, it seems good, and they would go out. Obviously that's pretty risky, but the locals were pretty good at it, and Scott and his buddies also were very good at this point at kind of reading the weather, and so they thought this day was going to be just fine. Now, in order to get to the place where they intended to fish, they would need to pass through something called the Alanui-Haha Channel, which is considered to be one of the roughest and most dangerous areas for all sailors anywhere near Hawaii. So it's a dangerous place. It's at certain points, it is almost 7,000 feet deep. There's very strong surface currents. It's just a risky place to be if, for example, there was a big storm. Now, when Scott and the Sarah Joe crew took off, the water was calm, the weather was beautiful, and by about 10 a.m., when they believed they must have been in the channel at this point, the weather was still very calm. However, a low pressure system had picked up very suddenly between 10 and noon. And so when they probably were somewhere towards the end of the channel, when they were going to be making their way into open water to fish, there was beginning to be torrential downpour all along the channel. And it eventually turned into a full scale hurricane. So on the island, people described this particular storm as being one of the worst they've seen in 50 plus years. This is like a sudden, freak, horrible storm. Of the boats that took off to go fishing out of this East Coast section of Maui, there was 4 fishing boats that went out. 3 returned. The one that didn't was, of course, the Sarah Joe. At 5 p.m., the Coast Guard is notified by their friends and family that they have not returned yet. The storm is still raging, gale force winds, torrential downpour, but they still send out a plane to look overhead. A number of crews were sent out to go look for them, even with the incredible risk of searching in this weather. But considering the dangers they were in, they decided it was necessary. The searchers who were in the boats, the boat crews that were sent out to look for the Sarah Joe crew, they said that at best they could see maybe 50 feet in front of them, and even that was a stretch. So it was a limited search, but they did go out on the day of the storm. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard led a search that included 44 planes and boats covering a 56,000 square mile search block for the Sarah Joe, but nothing was found. There was absolutely no trace of them, and so after 5 days, unfortunately, the Coast Guard called off the search. However, the people in their hometown in Nahiku, they knew these 5 men. These were incredibly capable, very experienced fishermen. They were all great swimmers. They believed that because they hadn't found a trace of them, that perhaps they were still alive out there. And so they, as a community, raised $50,000 to pay private ships and planes to continue the search. So there was an extended search that went on for a couple more weeks that covered an even bigger swath of territory, but at the end still yielded no results. The people that were doing the searching were just baffled, because when people go missing at sea, there's some indication a lot of times when they're just fishing basically right off the coast, there's some indication of what happened to them. It's rare that you would have 0% found. Absolutely no idea what happened to these 5 fishermen. 1 year after their disappearance, the families and friends decide to host a memorial and mourn the loss officially for their loved ones. It was believed at this point that they had all perished. 2,300 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands lies this tiny little stretch of, I guess you can call them islands, called the Taongi Atoll. And these little tiny strips of land that were barely higher than sea level barely sustained any life. There was a couple scrub plants that took hold here and there, but there's no fresh water. The only recorded human life that's ever been there was during World War II. A number of Japanese soldiers were stranded there briefly, but it is 200 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It's very far from any major shipping lane. It's just a place that, as a human being, you don't want to go. In fact, it was actually considered, when they were testing the atomic bomb, when the United States was, it was considered to be a great spot to test the atomic bomb because no one's there and no one's anywhere near it. So incredibly isolated. On September 10th, 1988, marine biologist John Naughton, along with 4 other crew members, descended upon the Taongi Atoll. They were sent there by the Marshall Islands to find a suitable wildlife sanctuary for some sea turtles and seabirds. Within 30 minutes of arriving at the atoll, John and his crew saw what looked like a skeleton of a boat, a Boston whaler boat that was down on the shore. John was actually a resident of Maui, so he's from Hawaii, and he saw on the back of this kind of skeletal remains of this boat the letters HA, which means it's registered in Hawaii. And so he's intrigued because we're 2,300 miles from Hawaii, and he starts moving the sand away to get a better look to see if there's any more writing on the boat. And he makes out a couple of letters, an S, an R, an H, an O, an E, and he puts it together. He's like, this is the Sarah Joe. This is the boat that went missing 9 years earlier. And the reason he knew it that quickly is because he was one of the people deeply involved in the search efforts to find these lost fishermen. He was like leading search groups. He was totally committed to finding them. And here he is in a crazy twist of fate, 2,300 miles away, almost a decade later, finding the boat. Now, the boat did not initially provide any sort of information about where the fishermen might be. There was nothing on it. It was just the wood, very degraded from water, wear and tear. But the crew decided that they would search the island and just kind of look around, because perhaps the crew, even if it was years and years ago, maybe they landed here and then they ultimately perished once they were here. So maybe we can find their remains or just some sign that they might have been here. John walks about 100 yards away from the Sarah Joe, and he sees what looks like kind of a crudely constructed cross out of driftwood. And below it, he can see that there's a bunch of rocks that have been placed definitely in some sort of decorative way, and it looks like a gravesite. And considering what they're looking for, he thinks there's the first of the bodies that we're going to find. He calls over his crew, and so they begin kind of moving some things aside. They don't want to totally disturb the grave, just to be respectful. But a little ways down, the inside of the grave is not only bones, but they find this little book. The book had no writing in it, and it's hard to even call it a book. It was more like a stack of papers. But on each page, there was a little square cutout of tinfoil that sat on the page. Basically, every page had a little square of tinfoil and nothing else to it. No one knew what it meant, but undoubtedly, somebody had very clearly buried somebody else right here in a very shallow grave and had left this little book in here with whoever was buried here. And so while John and a couple of his crew are looking at this book and trying to make sense of it, one of his crew members that was just kind of standing back looking at the site commented that, the bones that are in that grave, they're not very bleached. Now, if a bone's been sitting for a long time, it will basically bleach and become totally white. Everything comes off the bone. These bones looked relatively fresh. So whoever was buried here, they had been buried recently. At this point, John and his crew have basically abandoned their kind of wildlife sanctuary research, and now they're just scouring this little scrub of land in the Taongi Atoll for any other signs of, things that could have to do with the Sarah Joe crew, and they found nothing else. So they report back to the Coast Guard and alert the Marshallese authorities that what was found on the island, and they send out a couple of forensic experts to examine the bone. They were able to determine that the bones in the grave belonged to Scott Moorman. When news got back to the Hawaiian mainland that Scott Moorman had been found, the family members of the other 4 fishermen that went missing on the Sarah Joe, they hired private detectives to go scour the Taongi Atoll, look everywhere, see if you can find our loved ones' remains. And so This team of private detectives and a dive team and all these people are sent to the Taongi Atoll, and they look everywhere. They're digging up the sand. They have dive teams going out into the water. I mean, they are really leaving no stone unturned. And all they're able to find is the outboard motor of the Sarah Joe, which was a little ways off the coast from where the boat itself was found, wedged in some coral. And then they also found a handful of more bones on the beach near where that shallow grave where Scott Moorman was buried. But those bones also belong to Scott Moorman. So there was nothing else found of the other 4 fishermen or any indication of what happened to the boat. There's nothing. And in fact, researchers that were able to look at the bones of Scott Moorman, there wasn't enough evidence there to help them determine a cause of death. So we don't even know how he passed away or when he passed away. However, it was determined just based on the bleaching of the bones that it was a relatively recent death. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but recent is the term that's used. While it was a very big deal that they located Scott Moorman's remains on the Taongi Atoll, even though it was 10 years later, this is revelatory. This is a really big deal, not only for the families of the fishermen, but for anybody involved. This is a really big deal. But there was an additional revelation once Scott Moorman's bones were found that basically turned this case upside down. There's already a bunch of questions like who buried Scott Moorman? How did Scott Moorman become freshly buried almost a decade later? You know, how long had they been there? There's some basic questions that you're going to ask. But there's one fact that nobody seems to be able to reconcile. And that was 6 years after they went missing, the Marshall Islands conducted a government survey of the Taongi Atoll, which would mean they scoured the islands, all those little strips of land that make up the Taongi Atoll. They scoured it, just taking measurements and basically mapping out the Taongi Atoll. I think it was in preparation for potentially turning it into this wildlife sanctuary. So they looked everywhere on the Taongi Atoll 6 years after the Sarah Joe went missing. So they go missing. 6 years later, there's this government survey of the Taongi Atoll. And guess what? They ended up looking at that survey, and there's no boat, there's no shallow grave, there's nothing. It's just an uninhabited strip of land, nothing else. There's no boats there. Experts, when this was revealed, said that, well, had they, the Sarah Joe, the crew of the Sarah Joe, gone dead in the water following the storm, they could have drifted the 2,300 miles to the Taongi Atoll in roughly 3 months. But they weren't there at the 6-year mark. So what were they doing between the disappearance and the 6-year mark, which would have been the earliest they could have arrived, because prior to they would have been discovered during this audit. So you have a 6-year gap where no one can account for where they were. Even if they made it to the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day after they had disappeared, that they had been somehow surviving in the open ocean for 6 years, and they just so happened to land at the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day later. Basically, just after the survey's done, let's say they make it there. Who buried Scott Moorman? And what was the booklet that was buried with him with the tinfoil squares? This is a totally uninhabited stretch of land. There is no one there to perform any sort of burial ritual. Even if we're willing to say that maybe one of the other fishermen buried Scott Moorman, well then where are the other fishermen? Some people wonder, are they still alive? So like many of my videos, unfortunately, there isn't really a good conclusion here. It just kind of ends in a bunch of questions. But I would love it if you included in the comments section what you think could be the reason behind that 6-year gap. How can we account for those 6 years when they were not at the Taongi Atoll? I mean, my suggestion would be maybe the survey wasn't done very well and they just missed it. But that still doesn't also answer, well, who buried Scott Moorman? And also, why were his bones not so bleached? How did he come to be freshly buried 9.5 years after he disappeared? So lots of questions. I would love to hear your theories, your comments, your takeaways in the comments section. And again, if you liked this video, please hit like, Please click subscribe, turn on all notifications, because I'm going to be posting stories like this one 3-4 times a week. I love doing this, and I hope you'll come along. If you want to follow me on other social media channels, my handle on Instagram is JohnBallen416, and I am MrBallen, one word, on every other social media platform. I post quite a bit on TikTok, so you can check me out over there. That's going to do it, guys. I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to reading your comments. See ya. I don't know about you, but I am far more interested in mysteries that have occurred in the relatively recent past. I think it's easier to relate to the people involved because they probably lived their lives kind of similar to how you're living now. Different, but similar, right? You know, and also like the information, if you're looking at a case that happened 50 years ago or less, it's easier to fact check that information, and there's probably more information about that case. Whereas if you're looking at something that's happened, let's say hundreds and hundreds of years ago, while certainly there are people involved in being a human being, I can relate to them in that sense, but the way they live is a lot different than we live now. And so it's very difficult to kind of put myself in their perspective, because my experience living on the earth is so much different. And of course, information, even if it was diligently transcribed at the time, it's taken hundreds of years to arrive in front of me now. And so the opportunity for information to change or to be passed down inaccurately or to just be a straight up embellishment is much higher. So the accuracy of information in older cases, it's a little bit up for grabs. So I tend to be interested in more recent mysteries. But there is one case, in fact, it is the oldest unsolved mystery in American history that I have been fascinated with ever since I heard about it in grade school. And the reason I'm talking about it now in this video is not only have I found it fascinating, but there has been some recent discoveries, as recent as 2011, that totally changed the theories about what could have happened in this particular case. And the case I'm referencing is the lost colony of Roanoke. The too long didn't read version of the story is when England first tried to colonize America, they set up a colony on Roanoke Island, which is right off the coast of North Carolina. And when it wasn't going very well and the early colonists, they needed more supplies, they sent their leader back to England to get more supplies. But when he came back, the colony was gone. All 115 people gone without a trace. And all that was left were two strange messages. One was on a tree and one was on a fence post right in where the colony used to be. And for centuries, historians and amateur sleuths alike have debated what those messages mean. But a recent discovery in 2011 completely changes people's interpretation of what happened at Roanoke. Before we get started, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, well, you've come to the right channel, because that is literally all I'm going to be doing, and I post 3 to 4 times a week. So if that appeals to you, if you would, please gently assassinate the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of these cool stories. All right, let's dive in. By the late 1500s, England wanted to colonize America. And in the early 1580s, an Englishman by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh was basically given a permit to go colonize America. Basically it said, okay, it's 1580 and you have until 1591 to colonize somewhere in America. If you can't do it by then, you're gonna lose your permit. He starts getting funding together. He starts looking on a map to figure out where's a good spot to land. And by 1584, he's ready to launch his first reconnaissance mission to America. So in 1584, 2 ships make their way to North America and they land somewhere in the Outer Banks in North Carolina. They land and they actually quickly befriend the local Native Americans that are there. And in fact, they invite these English people to come to their village, which was on Roanoke Island, also in North Carolina, not too far from the Outer Banks. And so these early English settlers are brought to this village and they're able to coexist with the Native Americans really beautifully. They're sharing trade secrets, they're learning how to hunt, they're learning how to do all the things that you would need if you were going to live in this new land. And again, they're being embraced by the local population, which was huge. So after 1 month of this reconnaissance mission, that group of early settlers is really excited about the possibilities of settling in America. So they make their way back to England, and they share their findings with Sir Walter Raleigh, and preparations are immediately began to launch an actual colonization effort into Roanoke. So 1 year after this initial reconnaissance mission, Sir Walter Raleigh is ready to launch this full-fledged effort to colonize America. And so he sends 7 ships with 600 men and supplies that were designed to last that group of people for a full year. And so everything's going beautifully. They're sailing their way over to America. And when they reach the Outer Banks, their flagship, the biggest and best ship they had that was carrying the bulk of their supplies, their food, their fresh water, it ran aground, and a lot of their supplies fell into the ocean and were spoiled. And so this is a devastating blow, and they know immediately that, well, not everybody on this fleet can actually land here. So they sent 500 men back to England and only landed 100 of the original 600 in Roanoke. Now, as soon as this second round of settlers, these 100 men, landed in Roanoke, they went and spoke with the local Native Americans. There was already good relationships built from that first reconnaissance mission, and these settlers were given permission by the local natives to build their colony in Roanoke. So they begin constructing their colony, and everything is going off without a hitch. In fact, the Native Americans were incredibly generous. They worked closely with the settlers and, did their best to support them however they could. Now, the settlers, they still needed more supplies. They didn't have this robust supply that they planned on having because much of it was destroyed in that shipwreck as they initially made their way in. So they had been promised by the 500 returning crew members that they were going to send supplies by the following winter. So they're anticipating this shipment of new supplies, and as they get closer to the winter time, the 100 settlers that are there, they're running incredibly low on supplies to the point where they actually basically run out. And so they had to rely on the local Native Americans' generosity just to stay alive. When the shipment that was supposed to be there in the winter did not show up, and in fact had actually been canceled, they didn't know this, it had been canceled by Queen Elizabeth, who basically said that wasn't important, we're going to focus on things that are happening in England. When that doesn't show up, the tensions between these 100 settlers and the local natives, the tension was growing because now there's a huge overdependency. That tension grew to the point where the leader of the settlers and the leader of the local Native Americans began to not trust each other. And in fact, the local natives, instead of being violent, decided that they would just abandon Roanoke and go to the mainland and would just kind of give Roanoke Island to the settlers, and that would kind of solve all the problems. But the English settlers took their retreat as a sign that they were actually going to the mainland of North Carolina, these Native Americans, and were going to be forming alliances with other tribes, and then they were going to come back out and wipe out the 100 settlers. We don't know if that's true because what happens next is the English settlers, in kind of a fit of paranoia, they preemptively cross the water and they make it to the mainland and they attack the Native Americans that had previously been helping them and keeping them alive, and they actually wiped them out. These English settlers come back to Roanoke Island, and now the paranoia is even higher because now they don't have supplies, they don't know how to live there, they've just basically started a war, and it just so happens that an English-bound fleet was passing by the area on their way back to England, and when they stopped at the colony, the settlers were basically in a panic. I mean, at this point, they've just recently wiped out this Native American tribe. They're freaking out about what's going to happen to them. And they were in such a rush to abandon the colony and evacuate that only 97 of them got on the ships and left. They literally left 3 people there. They said, well, they're not here for the evacuation, so we're out of here. And so sure enough, that fleet took the 97 settlers and they left, leaving those 3 settlers to fend for themselves. As irony would have it, just days after this evacuation, Sir Walter Raleigh, he had sent additional ships with resupplies and reinforcements to Roanoke, and they literally arrived like a couple days after this mass evacuation, but when they arrived, the colony was abandoned and they didn't find those 3 men that were left there. So Sir Walter Raleigh's reinforcements just left. And then a couple weeks later, another English-bound fleet passed by Roanoke and stopped to check in on the colony, and they found it abandoned. And because they had so many people on this fleet that was passing by, they decided to leave 15 crew members at the colony because they felt like this is an English colony. It's not in total disrepair at this point, and perhaps this is going to be useful to the crown, or we can use it in some way. So they leave 15 crew members to basically guard the outpost while they go back to England and figure out what's going to happen next. So it would be months before anybody went back to Roanoke. So those 15 crew members were kind of hung out to dry a little bit. But a man by the name of John White, who had been a part of that initial failed colony in Roanoke, who had evacuated back to England, he was still eager to colonize America. And so he actually convinced Sir Walter Raleigh to launch a new expedition back to America to try to recolonize, not in Roanoke, but slightly north in the Chesapeake Bay, which was just viewed as a more fertile and just more advantageous position. And then in 1587, they send out 3 ships back to America to try this colonization effort all over again. It is important to note that unlike the first effort, which was much more kind of militaristic, it was literally 600 men that got sent to America. This time it was going to be a more kind of civilian approach, where it was men, women, and children being sent over to America to colonize. So with John White as the captain of these 3 ships, they're making their way towards America, and again, their plan was to go north to the Chesapeake Bay area, but they intended to pass by Roanoke on purpose because they knew about those 15 crew members that had been left there, almost a year prior. And so they intended to stop at Roanoke and basically have a meeting with those crew members, give them supplies if they needed it, and then make their way up to the Chesapeake Bay. However, something strange happens where the chief navigator, a man by the name of Simon Fernandez, who had navigated during the initial reconnaissance mission, the very first trip to America, also navigated for the second trip to America when they brought the 600 men, now navigating for this 3rd trip with John White. He had the charisma of a real leader and was frankly just very well respected. He's an incredible sailor. And even though John White was technically the captain, really it was Fernandez that really had the respect of all of the people on this trip to America. And so for some reason, Fernandez decided that he just didn't want them to go up to Chesapeake Bay. And instead, when they got to Roanoke to have this meeting with the 15 crew members, he just basically told everybody to get off. Like, we're not gonna go north. Everybody that's here to colonize, go ahead and get off because we're out of here. And John White didn't put up a fight. I think he recognized that the pull this guy had was gonna be too much. And the crew and everybody who was there just kind of accepted it. And so even though it was a total deviation, they just begin to colonize Roanoke, even though, again, that was never their plan. So as they're literally descending upon Roanoke, they're getting ready to meet with these 15 crew members who they're really hoping are still alive, but there's no sign of them. There's no sign of the crew that were left behind, and all they find is like a little pile of bones. And John White speculated that, perhaps this is a sign that the crew members were, attacked by, the Native Americans that were seeking revenge because they had been wiped out from that initial group that had been here, the initial English settlers. John White's suspicions would actually be proven true when just a few days after the 100-plus group of colonists that kind of began setting up camp in Roanoke, a man by the name of George Howe was away from the colony a little bit, and a group of Native Americans surrounded him and shot him with 16 arrows. So it was kind of like a message to the settlers that, like, you're not welcome here. Your predecessors that wiped out an entire tribe, yeah, we haven't forgotten about that. So you're not allowed to be here. It was not a good start for John White and his new colony. Feeling like the colony was kind of doomed from the start, the colonists actually told John White, hey, if this is the way it's starting, we need more people here, we need more supplies, like this is not a good start. We are not set up for success here. You need to go back to England and get more supplies and bring them back here, because without that, we're doomed. And it just so happened that Fernandez, the guy that had kind of ditched them, he hadn't left the Outer Banks yet. He had anchored at the Outer Banks, and he was basically still available to take people back. And so John White initially was against the idea because he didn't want to be viewed as someone that was kind of abandoning the colony when he got back to England. And John White's daughter, who was pregnant, was there. She was one of the early colonists. She was there in Roanoke, and he didn't want to abandon her. But ultimately, he says, okay, I'll go. And he goes and gets on Fernandez's ship, and they go back to England. Now, unfortunately, when he got back to England, England was in the middle of a war with Spain. And so the Queen had ordered any English ship was basically not allowed to leave England because they needed to be able to defend themselves against the Spanish Armada. And so he wasn't able to leave England to go back to Roanoke, whether he had supplies or not, for 3 years. And so 3 years go by, and he finally, with the help of Sir Walter Raleigh, is able to be put on a convoy of ships that is going back to America with the necessary supplies. And so he heads off. So it's 1590, 3 years since John White has left Roanoke, left his daughter, and to go back for supplies. Now he's back, and he's got the supplies, and they get to the Outer Banks, and they get in their small boats to make their little journey up around to the north side of Roanoke so they can actually get on the island and go check out what's happening at Roanoke. And when they land on the north side of Roanoke, they start yelling to try to get anybody's attention. There's no answer. As they walk up into the woods, they notice that there are some fresh footprints right on the beach and then in the woods itself. But again, no one's coming to greet them, which is a bit of a bad omen, because if there are fresh tracks, either it's an English settler, in which case they would be eager to come see them, they'd be running out to meet them, or it's a Native American, which could mean they don't trust the English settlers, right? They don't want to show themselves, or they don't want to be seen, which is also kind of ominous. They start moving in to where the Roanoke colony was, and they see 3 letters on a tree. It just says CRO on a tree as they're making their way into the colony. And again, they're yelling the whole time, trying to get anybody's attention, and no one's calling out. There's no sign of life anywhere. So they see CRO on the tree, and then they keep moving closer, and now they break out the colony. And the colony, when they left, had not been heavily fortified. Now it was very heavily fortified with big pikes, basically with wooden pikes lining the outside of this basically looked like a fort. And on one of the wooden posts that was kind of fortifying the outside of Roanoke was the word Croatoan. There is not only nobody inside of this heavily fortified colony, this kind of fort, if you will, it looked like no one had been there in years. The grass was overgrown, basically anything of value had been looted effectively. The only things that were left were like really heavy objects that would have been difficult to move. But there was also no sign of a struggle. There was not like human remains anywhere. There wasn't a clear sign of struggle. I mean, obviously it's this well-fortified area, which leads you to believe that they were at least anticipating some sort of attack, but there was no sign of a struggle. They're just gone. John White, he would write about this experience when he arrived and just discovered the colonies vanished, 115 people just gone, right? He wasn't actually concerned because the writing that he saw on the tree and on the wooden post to him meant something really specific. Before he left to go back to England to get the supplies, he had spoken with the people that would be staying there and said, look, if you need to abandon Roanoke for any reason, we need to have a system worked out to where if I come back and you're gone, I need to know what happened. And so you need to leave me a clue. You need to write a clue somewhere of where your destination is. If you're going by choice, just write the destination. If you're being forced, write the destination with a cross. And that will, to me, signify that you've left in distress. And so when he sees Croatoan and Crow on the tree, to him, that just means, oh, well, they must have relocated to the island of Croatoan, which was 50 miles to the south. He would detail in his notes that before he left Roanoke in 1587 to go get those supplies, he said that the settlers had been talking about leaving Roanoke, abandoning Roanoke, and moving 50 miles north to the mainland, not 50 miles south to an island. The concern was the island was isolated and not a good place to have a colony, and so they were talking about leaving it. And so he just kind of casually mentions in his notes, oh, well, they were thinking about leaving to go 50 miles to the mainland, so that might be why they're at Croatoan Island. But that doesn't really make any sense, because you're just kind of abandoning one problem set for another. Like, you want to leave an island because an island has unique problems. Why would you go to another island? You would go to the mainland. So that was kind of problematic. So John White believes they've just up and relocated to the Croatoan Island. And so he quickly takes his men and he goes back to the ship, and they begin to turn and set their course to go south the 50 miles to the Croatoan Island. But as fate would have it, the anchor line snapped as they're trying to make their way south to the Croatoan Island, and the weather was getting progressively worse and worse, and they start drifting north and north until finally the captain of the crew just said, look, we cannot go to the Croatoan Island. It's not going to be possible. And so they had to return to England. John White never would return to America, so he actually would end up dying with absolutely no idea what happened to the colony. And in fact, no one really knew what happened to the colony. It was just this huge cliffhanger. The assumption is they've gone to the Croatoan Island, but no one could prove that they really had. Literally, for centuries, people just speculated as to what could have happened to this colony. I mean, there's the assumption that perhaps they did just go to Croatoan and eventually kind of assimilated with the Native Americans there, and they just became a part of the culture there. There was other theories that they were wiped out at some point by angry Native Americans, but it was all just assumptions until the 1930s, when a small stone was found by a man just out walking around, and he turned it into a museum, and they looked at it, and it was written by Eleanor Dare, who was the daughter of John White, the pregnant daughter that he had abandoned and didn't get to see again. And she detailed what had happened. And half of the colony got wiped out by Native Americans that were angry at them, and then another percentage were taken captive, and then there's a couple survivors that are barely able to survive that don't really expect to live very long. At the time this stone was found, I mean, everybody knew that the last we had heard from the Roanoke colony was that they more than likely had made their way to the Croatoan Island, because that was the word written on the post, the CRO on the tree. I mean, that's what made the most sense. And so why would there be this stone by the daughter of John White 50 miles to the north of Roanoke? Wouldn't it make more sense to have been found on either Roanoke itself or at Croatoan? Like, it didn't really add up. And so a lot of people speculated that that stone had to have just been a fake, a hoax. But in 2011, a major discovery is made in the Roanoke case that actually lends a lot of credibility to the stone that Eleanor Dare had apparently written on. John White was a painter by trade, and he had created all these maps of the colony, of Virginia, of North Carolina, of everywhere he went. He basically painted a map. It was customary when you were making a map, if you had small mistakes on your map, you would actually cut a new piece of canvas, and you would put the corrections on that piece, and then you would slap it over wherever your mistakes were made. And so it wasn't uncommon, if you were looking at a map, to see little patches kind of all over the map. And so for literally centuries, there were these maps that John White had created that had a number of these little patches on the map. And in 2011, somebody who was researching said, well, why don't we look under the patches and just confirm that they really were just that, little mistakes that were covered up and corrected with a patch. And it turned out that on one of the maps, there was a patch over a section of land 50 miles to the north of Roanoke, around the area where that stone had been found. And underneath the patch was a star. And the star was set to resemble a fort. So basically there is an English fort built, basically where that stone had been found. But it had been covered over with a patch, as if the fort was a mistake. right? Like, oh, whoops, shouldn't have been a fort there. And they put a patch over it. But upon closer inspection, the patch that had been put over that X on the map that signified a fort right where that stone had been found, well, on the patch, there was literally hidden ink where someone had drawn a similar X to denote a fort, and they'd put that over the obvious fort symbol that they were covering up. One could maybe make the case that they wanted to signify to someone that was maybe looking for invisible ink, they wanted to signify that that was where the fort was, but they didn't want someone who intercepted the map, for example, the Spanish, because they'd just been at war with the Spanish, they did not want them to know where a location of a fort was. Researchers began calling that site where there was that patch, Site X. Now, Site X is 50 miles to the north of Roanoke. And if you recall from what John White had put in his description when he was describing finding the writing on the tree and the post when he returned to Roanoke in 1590, he had referenced that the colony was planning to move 50 miles north to the mainland because that was a more suitable place to live. But of course, with the writing on the trees, everyone thought, oh, well, they end up going to Croatoan. Well, now as Site X, that is a location that lines up with what they had originally said they were going to do. And you have that stone written by Eleanor Dare at the same location. And so archaeologists descended upon the area that was Site X, and while they haven't confirmed that there's a fort or they haven't found a fort in the area, they have found metal and pottery that is potentially indicative of an English settlement. And in fact, right now, they're still doing all sorts of archaeological digs and research to try to determine if that is where the Roanoke colony went. But even if that is the answer to the mystery, that in fact, it was just this hidden map and this stone that said, yep, they went 50 miles north, it doesn't really answer the question, which is what everybody thinks of when they think of the Roanoke colony, of why was Croatoan written on the fence post? Why was Crow written on the tree? Why were they there? And how is it that with all these eyes and all this interest in this case, dating back to literally the 1500s, how has no one ever found even one of the remains of the 115 colonists that apparently just vanished into thin air? So it's a fascinating case with recent developments, which makes it even more fascinating. And I would love to hear if you have any theories about what could have happened to the colonists, to leave it in the comments so we can discuss it. So that's going to do it. If you want to be in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I post quite a bit on TikTok. My handle is MrBallen there. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, I'll talk to you guys soon. Something very strange seems to be going on inside of national parks in North America. Every year, hundreds of people go missing in these parks, but these parks are huge expanses of wilderness. So it's not particularly unusual that people might go missing inside of them. But every year, of those hundreds of people that go missing, there's always a few that go missing under very strange circumstances. Either the way in which they disappeared doesn't really add up. Someone will be watching or keeping an eye on someone, they'll turn around and then turn back and that person's missing and there's not a trace of them and they're never found again. Or you'll have instances of someone will go missing, there'll be an extensive search, there's no trace of them, and then they're found like miles and miles away in locations that are almost impossible to get to. Now, one man, David Politis, who's a former police detective, he began researching these very strange disappearances inside of national parks. It started when a park ranger actually approached him and said, hey, there's a bunch of weird things happening in state parks. You should look into it because you're a former detective. And so after looking into it, he discovered that there were so many oddities around many of these strange disappearances. And he saw there was many overlaps and similarities that he really dove into it. And he's examined thousands of these strange cases. By his count, 10,000 plus hours of research. He's written 4 books. They're all under the name Missing 411. If you Google Missing 411, you'll find a plethora of information about these cases. He has 2 documentaries out. And so David, while he doesn't actually take a stance as to, what's causing these strange disappearances, anybody that follows along with the Missing 411 cases is basically led to believe that something is hunting humans in North America inside of national parks. It is fascinating, it is terrifying, and I've picked out 5 of the most bizarre cases that I've come across inside of Missing 411. Before we get into those 5 stories though, if this is the type of content that you're interested in, the strange, dark, and mysterious that I've kind of promised in this video, well, that's what my channel is all about. And I post 3 to 4 times a week. And so if that's your style and you like that type of content, if you could, please gently lambast the like button and then please turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the stories. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin, his brother, his father, and his grandfather headed up to the Smoky Mountains to go camping. This was a family tradition on Father's Day, and they were really excited about it. They get to the same campsite they always used. They set up, they have a wonderful first night, they camp out, and the next day, another camper in the area happened to walk by and saw that Dennis and his brother were playing there. And so this camper had kids as well, and he asked Dennis's father, hey, would it be okay if I brought my kids by? They're the same age as your sons, and they can just play together. Dennis's father says, sure, bring them down. And so the man goes, gets his kids, they come back, and before long, all the kids are playing hide and seek. Now, Dennis's father would say that he had an eye on Dennis the whole time. He was just at a distance, but watching his son to make sure he didn't get lost. And so at one point, all the kids are hiding from the parents. And, at some point, the parents say, okay, show yourselves. And all the kids, except for Dennis, show themselves. And Dennis's father has watched Dennis go behind a particular tree. He watched him do it. He was watching the whole time. And so when they said, come on out, and he didn't come out, he actually wasn't that concerned because he knew exactly where his son was. And then after a few moments, he yelled to his son directly and starts walking over and says, Dennis, come out, Dennis. I know you're behind the tree. And when he finally got over there, Dennis wasn't there. Dennis's father immediately starts running off into the woods, screaming for his son. And he actually ends up running almost 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, just hollering for his son, and he can't find him. And then the rest of the family had broken up and was searching the area because they're thinking like, he couldn't have gone very far. He was literally just here. And Dennis's father had said before, like, I watched him go behind the tree. I watched him. I don't know where he is, but I watched him go behind the tree. And so they're searching everywhere, and Dennis is gone. So a huge search, in fact, the biggest search in park history, ensues with 1,500 searchers that included the Army Green Berets, so the special forces got involved. They are combing a 60 square mile plot. They're looking everywhere, and there is nothing. There is no trace. There's no scent. There is nothing connected to Dennis Martin anywhere. And so they go back to Dennis's father and they're like, you have to tell us what you saw. Again, this doesn't add up. If you were looking at the tree and he was right there, how is it that he has just vanished into thin air? But no one knew. That was it. No one knows what happened. There's no closure. He's just gone, and they never knew what happened to him. Years later, when David Paulides was doing his research for Missing 411 and was researching the Dennis Martin case, he interviewed other families that had been at the campground at the same time that Dennis had gone missing. And one of those families was the Key family. And they had asked a park ranger where they could go on the campground where they might be able to see some bears. And so the park ranger obviously said, be careful, but you can go over here to this section of the campground and you might see a bear. And so they head over there and they're looking for bears. And one of their children hears a scream or thinks he hears a scream and kind of directs the family to look in the direction of the scream. And from their vantage point, they could see up onto the side of this mountain where there was, call it sparse trees all over the mountain. So you could kind of see in between the trees. And they saw what looked like a bear running along the mountainside, but with something slung over its shoulder. Except the interesting thing about this bear was the father was quoted as saying that it didn't really act like a bear. It was acting more like a human the way it was running. It looked, hairy and like an animal, but it was running and dodging between trees. It was holding this, what looked like a child over its shoulder. It acted almost like a human. And so you have a bear man that has been spotted by the Key family, and they bring this up to the investigators that are looking into the Dennis Martin case. And, obviously the Dennis Martin investigators, they don't take this seriously. They think that they're just, saying some ridiculous thing for attention or whatever it is. So, it never really was entered into the case with Dennis Martin. It wasn't until the missing 411 cases that it was ever connected. But there really was a family that claims to have seen a bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin had gone missing in the same area where Dennis Martin had gone missing. In the spring of 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing with his siblings outside of his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon. And when the kids were all called in to have lunch, Keith was nowhere to be found. And so the siblings and the family went out and did a cursory search looking for Keith. And when nothing turns up, they call in authorities and a full-fledged search is launched for Keith. There's no sign, there's nothing. And 4 miles away from the ranch, they find several hours later some footprints that look like they might belong to a 2-year-old. And they start tracking those footprints and they go on for miles and miles, and then they just kind of stop. And it wouldn't be until the next day, 12 miles away from the ranch, that they would ultimately find Keith. Surprisingly, Keith, who had disappeared with not enough clothing to be out in sub-zero temperatures with snow on the ground and being 2 years old, he wasn't prepared for a night out. He was found alive, face down, 12 miles away. His jacket and his hat had been stacked neatly next to him, and he had scratch marks all over his face, but he was unhurt. When asked, what happened, he's 2 years old, he had said a cat scratched him, and he kept repeating that a cat had scratched him. That was the only thing that he could articulate. No one knew how a 2-year-old, in the span of 20 hours, could have moved in the middle of the night 12 miles away. Les Stroud, who's a very accomplished outdoorsman, he's the star, he is Survivor Man, he actually, because of this case, went out and tried to actually cover the distance in the allotted time. You have 20 hours to cover this 12 miles. And he couldn't do it. And he even said, it's not possible for a 2-year-old to have covered this distance, let alone survived the exposure to the elements in the time that he was out there. But somehow he did. And, years and years later, Keith was interviewed, because now he's a grown man. He was interviewed about what happened, and he has no idea. He has no memory of it. At the end of 1973, 19-year-old Charles McCullough, who was an amateur photographer, had been doing a West Coast tour of the United States, going to all the different national parks to photograph beautiful scenery. And by January of 1974, he was in Oregon and wanted to go to Crater Lake, where he wanted to take pictures of Crater Lake. So he asked his friend, who had an all-terrain vehicle, to take him out to Crater Lake, because his van, which was this VW beat up old van, it couldn't have made it out that far. And as his friend is driving him out to Crater Lake, Charles says to him, kind of jokingly, if you don't hear from me in a couple of days, file a missing person report. And sure enough, a couple days later, when Charles doesn't show up, that friend does file a missing person report, and an extensive search is conducted at Crater Lake to find Charles. There's no sign of Charles. There's nothing. There's no anything about Charles. And his father actually flew out there and stayed for several months, just constantly searching the area, found nothing. So nothing is found. So a year later, a couple of backpackers were hiking the area around Crater Lake, and they get lost. They take a wrong turn, and they're well off the trailhead, and they discover a backpack. In the backpack, they found a strange-looking Volkswagen key that anyone that knew Charles McCullough knew that he had this strange key. And so when they found it, it was a distinctive key. And so when they gave it to police, it turned out that it was Charles McCullough's backpack. So investigators went out and started looking in the area that this backpack was found, which was 12 miles off the trailheads. This is well off the trailhead. And near the backpack, they find what remained of Charles McCullough. So they found his pants unbuttoned and on a log, as if he was sitting on the log and then just disappeared into the ground. But his pants were still there. Sticking out of the pants were his socks, no shoes, and in the socks were his feet bones. There was no jacket, there was no upper portion of his skeleton. 12 feet away, they find a portion of his skull. And that is the last thing they find of Charles McCullough. And ultimately, it was determined that he died of natural causes. His family was not prepared to accept that. However, when you look at some of the circumstances, we have, he's missing his jacket, he's missing his boots, he's missing his photography equipment, his head is detached from his body. He was also 12 miles off the trailhead. And when he went missing, there had been approximately 5 to 7 feet of snow that had dumped in the area. So how did he move 12 miles off the trailhead in 7 feet of snow, especially when you consider he was not an outdoorsy type. And even when he got dropped off by his friend that drove him out there, he even said later on that he felt like Charles was very ill-equipped for the environment he was going into. But at the end of the day, it was left as, sorry, he went missing and he died of natural causes, and that was that. Bart Schleyer was a famous outdoorsman and hunter. He was just one of those people that you could drop into any environment and he's not only going to survive, he's going to thrive. A testament to that would be he spent months in Siberia tracking and catching Siberian tigers. He was like a world-renowned tiger tracker. He's just like this super rugged, super competent outdoorsman. In September of 2004, Bart books a float plane to take him 175 miles north into the Yukon Territory in Canada for him to go hunt moose on his own for 3 weeks. He had all the right equipment. He was obviously extremely capable and no one thought twice about it. When he got dropped off, he told the pilot, meet me back here in 3 weeks. And so off he went. The plane leaves and comes back 3 weeks later, and there's no Bart. Now, the pilot knew Bart was like a god in the wilderness, and so he wasn't really concerned, but, he went over to where he had been told his campsite would be, and he found the campsite. And it looked like someone was still living there. It didn't look like it had been destroyed at all. And then near his campsite, he found a dry bag, which looked like it had an indent on it where someone might have been sitting on it up against a tree. And then next to the tree was his bow and some arrows. And it looked like an area where a hunter might have been sitting to call in moose, but there was no Bart. Near the dry bag and the bow and arrow, they found Bart's teeth and a couple of shards of bone. Initially, the thought is, well, a large predator must have snuck up on Bart and eaten him. Except there's a couple of huge problems with that theory. One, Bart, his friends at least would say, and people that knew him would say, he would never get snuck up on by a large predator. He was so accomplished in the wilderness, like he was always a step ahead of everything around him. So the idea that he would just be sitting there one day and a bear would just happen to sneak up on him is pretty far-fetched. Also, in the area where his teeth and some of his bones were found, there was no sign of what they call a death struggle, where you're fighting for your life, you're smashing into everything. There's none of that. There's no marking on the ground or in the surrounding areas that a large predator had attacked him. Also, his camp had food out in the open. And if a large predator had come through like a bear, after, it finished with Bart, it would have raided the campsite, and it didn't. And so the way this was left was he was attacked and eaten by a predator. But nobody believes that because that wouldn't happen to Bart, and the circumstances around his campsite didn't really add up. In 2002, Christopher Tompkins was working as a surveyor, and he was assigned to this 4-man survey crew that was working in Harris County, Georgia. And they were walking along this road spaced about 50 feet apart, all 4 of them. And Chris was the last one in line. And the third one in line would later tell investigators and police that as they were walking along the road, he would periodically turn around to just, for a quick second, make sure Chris was still there. And as they're walking along with no sound or any indication that anything's happened, he turned around, saw Chris, kept walking. A few minutes later, turned around, and Chris is gone. The third guy hails the other 2, and they go, and they're like, where did Chris go? They're looking down the road, like maybe he stopped, maybe he stepped off the trail, but they can't see him. And they go back they start walking down the road towards where he would have been, and they find on the ground a pile of loose change and some of his tools that would have been in his pockets. And then they see one of his boots stuck in the barbed wire, because there's a little barbed wire fence that was running the length of this road. One of his boots was stuck in the barbed wire, and there was nothing else. They search the area, they're looking everywhere, there's no sign of him. And it didn't make any sense to the people in this survey crew, especially the guy who was third in line, who was like I literally saw him a minute ago. And there's no way he could have gotten away without me hearing or seeing some indication of where he was. But there was no sign of him and he was gone. So after this huge investigation, they don't find any sign of him. And that's it. They're just like, yeah, he's gone. They did find 9 months later, they found his other boot near a swamp 900 yards away, but it didn't provide any more clarity into what happened to him. However, if you look at the pile of loose change and things that were in his pockets that were on the road, it indicates that at some point he may have been turned upside down. And if you think about the entirety of all of these strange stories where the idea being someone could be hunting humans, just picture in your head Chris Tompkins walking along and something flipping him upside down, dumping the contents out, and then being gone in a matter of a minute where no one can see where they went. These 5 stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of others that are covered in the Missing 411 series. And while many people believe that all of the cases in Missing 411 and any others that ultimately are considered strange inside of these national parks have a rational explanation, even if we don't know what it is. Whereas another group believes that this Missing 411 phenomenon is an indication that something is hunting humans in the national parks across North America. Some say Bigfoot, some say aliens, some say something else. But paranormal is certainly the other camp in terms of trying to explain away what these strange disappearances are from or what's causing them. Whether or not we ever find a definitive conclusion remains to be seen, but I would love to hear what you think is going on inside of these strange cases of Missing 411, whether it's a rational explanation or maybe something paranormal or some other option. But I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. And that's going to do it, guys. If you enjoyed this, please, if you could, gently lambast the like button and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads every week. If you want to get in touch with me, please DM me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. Also, I'm very active on TikTok, and my username is MrBallen over there as well. And that's going to do it, guys. Until next time, take care. One of the most terrifying movies I have ever seen has got to be The Exorcism of Emily Rose. What really made it scary was that it was based on a true story. The true story of Anneliese Michel, who was a 23-year-old girl living in Germany in the 70s, who was apparently possessed by demons. And there's a lot of audio recordings and some pretty incredible first-hand testimony of what happened to this poor girl. There's one scene in particular that, while it is a dramatization of what happened to Anneliese, it is certainly an accurate portrayal of what did ultimately physically happen to Anneliese Michel, and it is one of the most hair-raising, horrifying scenes in movie history, in my opinion. It is just downright disturbing. And so today, I'm going to be looking at the real story that movie is based on, which is, of course, the exorcism of Anneliese Michel. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well then you've come to the right channel, because that is literally all I do. And I upload 3, sometimes 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, if you could, please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Anneliese Michel was born in 1952 in Western Germany to a fiercely religious family. Devout Catholics who believed in some of the more extreme elements of the Catholic faith. Now, one of the things that they believed in and certainly pushed on to Anneliese and her siblings was this idea that sin could not be atoned on your own. It would require other people effectively sacrificing on your behalf for you to be absolved of your sin. And so Anneliese and her siblings would be instructed by her parents to, at times in the winter, sleep on the hardwood floor. In order to repent for sinners that can't repent for their sins on their own. And so she'd be laying on the floor in the middle of the winter, thinking that what she was doing was saving other people from their own sin. In 1969, Anneliese would have her first seizure. She was at school, she suddenly started seizing up and convulsing, and her classmates would later tell investigators and her family that it was almost like she'd entered into a trance-like state while she was having this seizure. And then as soon as the seizure had ended and she was done convulsing, she snapped out of the trance-like state. It wasn't until a year later when Anneliese had another seizure in the middle of the night. She had this convulsion and her parents come in and she's in this trance-like state and she's wet the bed and then she snaps out of it and she doesn't know what happened. It wasn't until this second seizure that the family actually sought medical attention. They actually went to a neurologist. That neurologist would tell Anneliese and her family that what she was suffering from was something called temporal lobe epilepsy, where, amongst a litany of horrible side effects, a few of the more significant ones are serious auditory and visual hallucinations, a loss of awareness, and intense mental state. So Anneliese was prescribed medication by this neurologist to try to combat this temporal lobe epilepsy, but it didn't seem to do anything. And in fact, her seizures and convulsions and this trance-like state she would go into during the seizures, it only persisted and intensified. And it got to a point where Anneliese and her family believed the best thing for her to do would be to go to a psychiatric hospital where the staff there was better equipped to handle what was happening to her. And so she checks in willingly, and they start experimenting with different drugs, and nothing seems to work. And in fact, her condition only gets worse. She starts having more seizures and more convulsions, and she starts having a regular visual hallucination. Whether she's having a seizure or not, everywhere she looked, if she looked at anybody in the face, their face would become demonic. Like it would be a demon's face that would look at her and say, "You're going to rot in hell." And so she began not being able to look at people in the face, and she would tell the nurses and doctors, like with her head down, about these demon faces she was seeing. And it was the first time she began espousing this idea that she was in fact possessed by demons. In fact, 6 demons by her count. When she passed on that information to her family that she believed she was possessed, she and her family believed that the psychiatric hospital was not enough, and in fact modern medicine was really not enough to handle what was happening to her, that they would need to search for help outside of medicine, and so they turned to the Catholic Church. Initially, all the clergy that Anneliese and her family approached to try to help her with the situation rejected her request, and they said, "You need to seek medical attention. This is not something we can help you with." Not knowing where to turn, her family is kind of at a loss. At the same time, Anneliese's condition really nosedives. I mean, it was already pretty bad. It gets a lot worse. She began doing 400 plus squats every day, like compulsively doing squats. Then she began going under the table periodically and not coming out for 2 days, barking like a dog the entire time without sleeping. She began going to corners of the house and finding spiders and eating them off the ground. She would scurry over to the fireplace and pull coal out of the fireplace and eat the coal. I mean, she was really losing it. Finally, the family located a priest named Ernst Alt who believed she was possessed and that she was not epileptic, and he was willing to petition the local bishop to allow the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism. And so that bishop granted permission for a local priest, Arnold Renz, to perform an exorcism with the full endorsement of the Catholic Church. Over the next 10 months, Renz would conduct 67 exorcisms of Anneliese. And through these exorcisms, Anneliese would reveal that she was being possessed by 6 demons: Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Nero, Fleischmann, and Adolf Hitler. And so all of these voices, these demonic voices that were coming out of Anneliese, they were picked up on audio recording during the exorcisms. And in the movie, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, the most iconic scene in the movie is the demon scene where they show off these voices coming out of, in the movie it's Emily Rose, but it's supposed to represent Anneliese Michel. And they do a fantastic job showing what that might have looked like during the exorcism. So take a look.
Give me your names, demons!
Names! Names!
Ancient serpents, depart from the servant of God! Tell me your 6 names!
We are the ones who dwell within.
And I am Lucifer, the devil in the flesh.
And now I want you to take that scene you just watched of Emily Rose being possessed by these demons and think about that as you listen to the actual audio recordings of Anneliese Michel during one of her many exorcisms.
Ja, ich will auch für die anderen leiden, damit die nicht in die Hölle kommen und so. Aber dass das dann so schlimm ist und so grausam und so furchtbar, nee.
Gekletze.
Nein,
Nein, Gekletze. Und er mal Gekletze. Oh, so der will er nicht. Ich hab dein Maul erschlagen. Die Ruhe gibt's nur da oben.
Ruhe gibt's nur dort, wo die Liebe ist.
Ja, bei uns gibt's nur ja nun. Die müssen in eigenen Seminaren ausgebildet werden, die dürfen nicht auf die anderen Universitäten. Kapiert?
Geist.
Nein,
Geboren hier auszufahren und nicht.
Initially, the exorcisms seemed to make things better for Anneliese. She got to a place where the seizures and convulsions and trance-like states and odd behavior were so few and far between that she actually re-enrolled in university and was even able to attend church, but it didn't last. In the spring of 1976, Anneliese's convulsions and seizures and odd behavior came back tenfold, and she began becoming violent with her family members to where they couldn't even be around her without being attacked by her. But when she was left on her own, she would harm herself. She stopped eating, saying that the demons were not allowing her to eat, and all day long she would stand up and then drop to her knees to pray, and then get back up and drop to her knees to pray, breaking both her kneecaps and tearing the tendons in her knees, which seemingly did not faze her. But still, her family believed that what she needed was religious intervention, not medical intervention. Also, Annalise felt the same way, but some might say that she was not in a position to make that decision, that she had lost her ability to make that decision. But either way, they continued with the exorcisms. The final exorcism of Annalise took place on June 30th, 1976, and while Annalise did submit willingly to this exorcism, she was incredibly frail. She weighed under 100 pounds, and by the following morning, on July 1st, 1976, she had passed away due to dehydration and malnutrition. She was only 23 years old. After her death, Annalise's story was so sensational that it grabbed headlines all over Germany, and people were clamoring to learn more about how this could happen. That she was, apparently possessed and then died after all these exorcisms. Why wasn't there medical intervention? There was so many questions. And so ultimately what happened is her parents were charged with negligent homicide, but were actually not given a jail sentence because at the time in Germany, they ruled that the parents had already suffered enough, so they did not serve any jail time. And there were two priests, one of them being Renz, who were charged with negligent manslaughter, and they were sentenced to 6 months in jail. That was later suspended. To this day, people are absolutely split down the middle about what actually happened to Annalise Michel. Was it possession, or was it, like the neurologist said, a form of epilepsy, or was it something else? And furthermore, was psychiatric treatment or was modern medicine doing enough to help her? Or were they failing just as much as the exorcisms ultimately failed? It's a question that to this day people are really unsure how to answer. Her gravesite has become sort of like a monument for many churches around Europe. They will go and basically make the pilgrimage to her gravesite to pay their respects to a girl that they believe in some way died for their sins. So what do you think this was? Was this demonic possession, or was this epilepsy? Or was it something else? And how do you think they should have treated this case? I mean, obviously the medication she was on was not making it any better, but at the same time, the exorcisms didn't seem to do much better either. So how do you treat something like this? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I possibly can. All right, that's gonna do it, guys. If you were interested in this story and like this type of content, if you would please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe to this channel, turn on all post notifications so you can get the 3 to 4 weekly uploads that happen on this channel every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen as well. That's going to do it, guys. Until next time, see ya. Nothing quite as satisfying as a true story that's mysterious and interesting, it sucked you in, that has a killer plot twist, a killer reveal. That, to me, is just the most satisfying thing you can find. I am a complete story addict, and so I go looking for these stories. I go literally searching for real-life stories with real-life plot twists. And in my opinion, the very best one is the story of the missing lighthouse keepers, and that is the story I'm going to tell today. So the too long didn't read version of this story is a crew is sent out to this lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. They're being sent out there to relieve the workers that are there, provide new supplies, and just kind of make sure everything is okay. When they get out there, nothing is okay. The 3 lighthouse keepers are missing. The island and the lighthouse are kind of in disarray. And then they find the lighthouse keeper's logbook, which, needless to say, is very strange. It has some entries in it that don't really add up. And then when you combine those entries with what some people had to say on the mainland that were watching the island, it really doesn't add up. So it creates this really epic plot twist. It's absolutely worth watching to the end, I promise. So let's get there. Off the coast of northwestern Scotland lies a stretch of 7 small islands. It's called the Flannan Isles. One of those isles is called Eilean Moor. And on Eilean Moor is a lighthouse, and that's where our story is going to be centered. But before we get into the story, Eilean Moor has some odd history to it. It's long been regarded as a place that's paranormal. In fact, on the island, Basically, the only people that inhabit it are the lighthouse keepers. Usually there's 3 or 4 of them, and sheep. And so sheep herders often go out to that island, and they're the ones that report hearing strange sounds and just feeling like they're being watched. It's a creepy place. And in fact, anybody that visits the island that isn't a sheep herder or a lighthouse keeper, even if they've never heard of the history of Eilean Mor, oftentimes report a very odd sense of being watched, of just not feeling right on that island. And so Eilean Mor really had developed a reputation as being a pretty creepy place. So in addition to just the strange aura around the island that basically anyone who went there reported, anybody that went to the Church of St. Flannan is its name, they reported feeling like they were being drawn to pray. That there was this overwhelming sense that you should be praying as soon as you walk into the church. And in fact, the draw was so strong, like getting on your knees and praying, that they developed this strange ritual that when you got to the island, it was customary that before you went in, you immediately dropped to your knees and crawled around the church on your knees before making your way inside and continuing to pray. So just a strange place with strange rituals. That's the scene that is set for this true life, very strange mystery. In December of 1900, a steamboat was passing by the Flannan Isles, and as they rounded their way past Eilean Mor, they noticed that the light was out. The lighthouse was not operational. And so when that steamboat finally got to port 3 days later, they told authorities that, hey, Eilean Mor is not operational. You should go check on them. And so as it happened, it was actually time to replace the lighthouse keepers that were at Eilean Mor. So Captain James Harvey gets his crew together, and he takes Joseph Moore, who's the replacement lighthouse keeper, and they head out to Eilean Mor to check on the lighthouse, check on the lighthouse keepers, but also replace them. So it was a changing of the guard and making sure that everything was okay. As you approach Eilean Mor, you would see a massive staircase coming up from the dock all the way up to where the lighthouse is. So from a distance, if you were looking at Eilean Mor, it would be fairly easy to break out anybody that was walking down the steps to get down to the dock. And since the island was really only inhabited by lighthouse keepers and sheep, the crew, Captain Harvey and his crew, as they're making their approach to Eilean Mor, they're watching those steps to see if the lighthouse keepers are going to notice them and come down and greet them on the dock, because that was customary. You always are at the dock ready to assist the crew as they come into Eilean Mor. That was just the way it was done. And so as they're making their approach, they're watching these steps, looking for signs that the keepers are coming down. Because on some level, the crew that's going out to replace them, on the back of their head, they're a little bit nervous that something's wrong. I mean, they know that the lighthouse was not operational, and that's part of the reason they're going out. So they're kind of like actively watching those steps. They're looking for signs that they're coming down to the dock. And as they get closer and closer, they don't see anybody come down the steps. They don't see anyone on the dock. And even worse, no preparations were made for the next crew to come into the dock. That was something that all lighthouse keepers did. They kept that dock, up to code so that if any time someone came in, they could properly dock and make their way up. So no preparations are made. No one is coming down to greet them. So the omen is pretty bad. And so Captain Harvey and his crew, they dock on the dock, and the captain and his crew say, hey, to Joseph Moore, you go up and just do a cursory examination of the island. Make sure these guys are okay. We'll stay down here for a minute. You go check. So Joseph Moore gets out, and he starts walking up this massive set of stairs where he can't see the lighthouse. He can only see the steps. It's pretty steep. And later he would say that he had this deep sense of just foreboding. Like something bad is about to happen. He felt very stressed out as he's walking up these stairs. And as he makes his way up, he finally kind of crests to where he can actually start to break out the top of the island where you can see the lighthouse and you can see, where they were staying. And the first thing he notices is the steel railings that line this massive staircase up to the island near the lighthouse itself. The steel railings had been bent over. Like imagine if it was made out of tinfoil. They had been folded onto themselves. Like pretty significant damage to, steel railings. And so he makes note of that. And he also notices that this big boulder that just, I don't think it was decorative. It just was on the island. And so they built around it. There's this huge boulder that just was right in front of the lighthouse. And it had been that way for, years and years. it had moved significantly, and you could actually see a trail underneath the boulder where it had rolled across the grass. So Joseph Moore, the replacement lighthouse keeper, is thinking to himself, my God, this is straight out of the storm of the century. Like, clearly the worst storm ever has hit this island. No wonder their lighthouse was non-operational, because they were hit with like the worst storm ever. And so that's his initial assessment. He goes up to the door. The door is unlocked, but shut. And he opens it up. First thing he does is he yells for the lighthouse keepers that are supposed to be there. They don't call back. There's apparently no one in the lighthouse. Before he even starts moving through the lighthouse, he looks on his right and he sees all the hooks where they would have kept their clothes. And one hook still is holding an oilskin jacket. And anytime you would leave the lighthouse, especially if you were leaving the island for some reason, there is no reason in the world you would not be wearing that jacket. So it's another kind of bad sign. It means that if they're not here, if the 3 lighthouse keepers are not inside of this lighthouse, why aren't all 3 oilskins gone with them? It's another sign that something terrible has happened. He looks into the kitchen, and on the kitchen table is plates of meat. There is, pickles that have just been pulled out of a jar, and a couple of the chairs have been upturned. And he also noticed that the mechanical clocks had stopped. And so he's thinking to himself, okay, something happened where they left in a hurry, because they toppled over chairs, they left food on the table, someone forgot their jacket. He continues moving through the lighthouse and he gets to their bedrooms, and all of their beds are unmade. Again, it was kind of customary that you would never leave the lighthouse unmade. You would make your bed because someone else could be coming in to relieve you. And so it was yet another sign to Joseph Moore that something had happened suddenly that caused the lighthouse keepers to abandon the lighthouse. Combining that with the massive damage from the storm, he's starting to think, something happened, this horrible storm is coming through. Like, maybe it got really bad really quickly and they didn't have time to make proper preparations. They didn't have time to do the things that were customary. They just had to kind of boogie out of there. So Joseph Moore returns to Captain Harvey and says, this is what I saw. And so Captain Harvey and the crew go back up and they kind of see it for themselves. And Captain Harvey ends up sending a telegram back to the mainland explaining that there has been a horrible tragedy here. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. After Captain Harvey sends this telegram, he and Joseph Moore and the rest of the crew continue to kind of search the island and do some investigating. And they discover the logbook that the 3 lighthouse keepers had been keeping. And so all of the entries are pretty standard. It was, common practice that you would mark down what happened that day, what ships you saw, just kind of basic log keeping of the lighthouse. But they start getting really interesting on December 12th. On December 12th, the leader of the 3 lighthouse keepers noted that severe winds, the likes of which he had never seen before, he's been doing this for decades, are passing through the island. And he's acting pretty worried about whether or not the lighthouse will be able to withstand this storm. He also noted that the other 2 lighthouse keepers were not doing well. He said one of them had been basically just praying nonstop. The other had been doing a bit of crying. Now, the man he's describing that is crying over the intensity of the storm was known on the mainland as one of the toughest, saltiest men on the planet, who had weathered dozens of hurricanes out on islands all by himself. And so for him to be crying over the severity of the storm just shows you how severe the storm really was. The entries on the 13th and 14th point to them believing that they're not going to get out of the storm alive. At this point, all 3 of them are just praying nonstop and are kind of anticipating at some point they're just going to get swept off the island. Then on December 15th, it just says, storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all. So Robert Moorhead, who is one of the leaders of the investigation, said that basically on December 15th, after that final entry was made, they must have gone down to the dock to secure some of the supplies and just kind of make sure that it wasn't totally damaged from all of the storm, and a rogue wave from this storm must have swept them away. When word got to the Scottish mainland about what had happened to these lighthouse keepers, the people that sat on the coast facing Eilean Moor, they were really confused, because whenever there's a storm out at Eilean Moor, they can see it because the island's not that far off the coast and they can see the storm. But over the past few days, namely December 12th to the 15th, which was the time period those log entries were made about the storm passing through, the people on the mainland of Scotland said that not only was there no storm, but in fact, the visibility onto Eilean Moor was better than it had been in years. They saw parts of the island that were only visible in perfect circumstances, meaning there was never any storm. So what the heck happened to those lighthouse keepers? What were those log entries about? Why were they drawn to tears? How did the railings get flipped over and the boulder get moved aside? Where did they go? In the years following their disappearance, other keepers were sent out to man that lighthouse, and all of them reported hearing someone yelling the names of the 3 lighthouse keepers that went missing. So pretty creepy stuff, and unfortunately it's still very much an unsolved mystery despite the official statement by Robert Moorhead. And so I'd love to hear in the comments what you think might have happened to the lighthouse keepers, and what could possibly explain that there wasn't a storm, but in the journal they said it was the worst storm ever, and there's physical damage done to the island. How do we reconcile that? Like, either someone's not telling the truth or something just doesn't add up. And I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. So if you haven't already, please like this video and hit subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. What's going on, guys? MrBallen here. Earlier, I had been saying you probably know me from TikTok, but the reality is the majority of people that are watching this video or who have watched my other videos are actually just from YouTube, which is really cool to feel like YouTube is promoting some of my videos. I think I'm incredibly lucky to have that be happening. I'm incredibly lucky to have this page growing as quickly as it is. And I'm incredibly lucky to have you paying attention, even if it's just for a few minutes. So thank you for tuning in. A little bit about me. I am a former Navy SEAL. I got medically retired at the end of 2017. I initially started making content that was pretty much exclusively about being a Navy SEAL and my experiences. But then when I got on TikTok at the end of 2019, early 2020, I kind of just completely pivoted and started sharing stories that I was just fundamentally interested in. Scary stories, true crime, mysteries, that type of content, purely because I enjoy it. I was very fortunate that it took off on TikTok, and here I am on YouTube, kind of trying to do the same thing, sharing content about, darker but really interesting, compelling stories. It's just something I'm passionate about, and I'm really happy that I'm starting to grow a platform that is based on that, because I would love to do this indefinitely. So today I'm going to be covering a very famous haunting. But before I get into any details about it, I want to be upfront with the people watching this video. This video and my channel in general are not designed to be, an attempt at convincing people that the paranormal is real or that ghosts are real. But rather, I want to cover stories that are just plain interesting. And I like covering things that are of the darker variety. True crime, certainly unsolved mysteries falls into that. I love that genre, the kind of dark, mysterious genre. And so this story really interests me because there's lots of photo evidence. There's multiple witnesses that kind of corroborate, not necessarily that ghosts are real, but rather that the events that led to people speculating it was a haunting. There are people that corroborate the details, meaning the story is cohesive, that the actors in the story basically corroborate one another. And so it leads us down a path to getting to the end of the story, and we're like, well, what the hell happened? Because if it's not a haunting, what was it? Because a bunch of things happened that are pretty difficult to explain. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have a single mom who moves into a home with her kids, and she starts hearing noises in the walls, in the attic. She can't make sense of it. She has friends and, the babysitter that are at the house that also hear it. Her ex-husband starts to experience it. You have all these people experiencing these weird phenomena happening in the house. And then, through a weird series of events that involves priests, landlords, and child protective services, they have a paranormal investigator come over with camera equipment and all that. They come in the house and they end up documenting quite a bit of startling imagery and footage that only lends credibility to the fact that this actually might be a real haunting. So that's the story in a nutshell. Let's dive in. In 1989, a 23-year-old woman named Jackie Hernandez has just broken up with her husband, Al. It was an amicable separation. They just weren't on good terms. They decided it's time to get a divorce, but we will, happily co-parent our 2 kids together. So it's an amicable breakup. Jackie moves into a small, modest home in San Pedro, California, with the kids. And she's working a ton. She's a student at night. She's working multiple jobs. It's a very hard, stressful time, but she's doing her best to support her family and kind of land on her feet. So about a month after living in this house, Jackie comes home from a long day at school and work, and she sits down, the kids are asleep, and she puts on the TV. And she's just trying to decompress. And as she's sitting there, she starts to hear what sounds like little pebbles falling down inside of the walls. So she mutes the TV and she's listening, and it's just periodically little pebbles are falling down the wall. She goes up and she's listening, or with her ear against the wall, and she's thinking to herself, there's got to be, a mouse or some critter up in my attic, unfortunately, that's kicking some pebbles into a gap in the wall. And as she's listening, she thinks she hears what sounds like footsteps in the attic. And so it startles her. Now she's really paying close attention to the attic. She doesn't hear it again. This is the first time she's heard anything like this, so she kind of did the very human sort of rationalizing what she had just heard and assumed she was just hearing things in the attic. It's just some critter. I'll deal with it later. So a couple days later, Jackie has her friend Susan over to just hang out with her at her house. The kids are asleep and they're relaxing, talking, sitting on the couch. And as they're sitting there, they hear a loud bang in the kitchen. It sounded like something had fallen. And so, at this point, Jackie had mentioned to Susan this weird, like, hey, I think I got an animal up in the attic because I heard some rocks falling through the walls. But the funny thing was I could have sworn I heard footsteps up there, but probably just my mind playing tricks on me. So Susan is keyed in that maybe there's a little bit of weirdness happening in the house. So when they hear this sound in the kitchen, it's like they both instantly go to, okay, what's happening here? Is this more to do with the footsteps in the attic, or is there a rational explanation? So they're on guard. They walk into the kitchen and they find a picture that was hanging on the wall that had fallen, which honestly that's not a cause for a ghost is in the house, but it was held up by a couple of nails. And the nails were removed from the picture frame and were standing on their head, point up, next to the image, next to the picture. So imagine if a picture falls, are all the nails going to come out and land perfectly on their head right next to it? No, it's almost impossible. But sure enough, that happened. So Susan and Jackie are staring at the picture, they're staring at the nails, and they have no idea what to make of it. Susan was a little bit more eager to connect it to these footsteps in the attic, but she also did not want to frighten her friend because she knows she's living alone. And so they kind of talked a little bit about it, and maybe they both wanted to have that discussion about what's happening in the house, but they both kind of decided, without saying anything, that we're going to kind of avoid this topic. And so they put the picture away, the nails away. Susan actually decides to just leave because she's a little bit freaked out, and so she's gone. The next night, Susan actually brings over a new babysitter. It's this 16-year-old girl named Tina. And so I guess, Jackie wanted a little bit of time to leave the house. She thought that she was kind of losing her mind with all the stress of work and school. And so Tina comes over. Jackie had not told Tina anything about what was going on in the house. It was just like, hey, take care of the kids. I'll see you in a little bit. She's sitting on the couch, Tina, the babysitter, and she just like, you know what, I'm going to go just check on the kids. I got a weird feeling to make sure they're okay in their bedrooms. And as soon as she goes to push the door opens, which she remembers in an interview saying it was strange that before it actually made contact with the door swung open. But, I didn't think anything of it. I walked in, the sun is just fine. So I walked back out and I shut the door. But as soon as I shut it, I turned around and it was starting to open again. And she describes thinking that, I guess, the house must be, not level or something. Jackie comes home and Tina tells her about the door. And I think that Tina on some level was hoping that Jackie, being the adult, would, hear what she was saying and have just a totally rational explanation for what was going on. The door always does that, something like that. But Tina was shocked when she told her this, and Jackie reacted visibly like she was concerned. And Tina's like keying in on it, and she was like, do you know why this could happen? Why the door would be kind of opening on its own? And Jackie just said, honestly, there's been a couple of weird things that have happened. And so they talked about it a little bit, but ultimately, they both just decided, you know what? I think that we're connecting things that don't need to be connected. It's just a couple of strange occurrences. So Tina leaves, Jackie goes to bed, and they don't think about it. So the next day, Jackie has Tina come back over because she needs some more help with the kids. And so as they're standing in the kitchen, Jackie's describing to Tina what she needs to do that night, when to feed the kids, what time to put them to bed. Tina just kind of stops paying attention to Jackie and looks up at the corner of the kitchen. And so in the back corner of the kitchen, Tina's looking and she says, "Did you put in a new light in the corner of your kitchen?" And Jackie looks too, and she's like, "Whoa, what is that?" And it looks like there's this light bulb, kind of a weird looking light bulb in the corner of the kitchen on the ceiling, which there wasn't a light bulb over there. And Jackie says as much, and they're looking at it, and then it begins to move. Not towards them, it was just kind of moving around, like an orb of light that was kind of moving around. And now, had Jackie and Tina relayed that particular experience, almost everybody or virtually everyone would be like, yeah, okay, you saw a floating light in your kitchen. Well, they took a picture of it because it didn't go away. So they went and got a camera and they took this picture. And so you can see there's this blob of light, that was in their kitchen. Between the pebbles in the wall, the footsteps in the attic, the falling picture with the nails standing on their head, with, Tina saying the door wouldn't shut, and now this orb of light. Now, Jackie has officially kind of gone from, I'm going to play this rational and not worry about it, to, I have no idea what's wrong and I can't explain this. I can't tell people this without them thinking I'm crazy, with the exception of Susan and Tina, because her kids were too young to know what was going on. There's no one that she felt comfortable sharing her anxieties and fear about what was happening, because how do you, a skeptical, rational person, go to for example, the police and say, hey, there's nothing in my attic, but I believe there's someone walking around my attic and kicking pebbles into my walls and knocking pictures off the wall and taking the nails out, standing them on the head. They're going to say that, well, are you doing this? Are your kids doing this? And so the only person that Jackie finally felt comfortable telling was her ex-husband, because they were still amicable. She has Al come over and she finally says to him, I have a lot of weird things happening. She showed him the picture of the lights in the kitchen. She describes everything that happened in the house. And Al would say that in a way, he thought that this was just kind of an act to maybe draw attention to the fact that she was lonely and that she missed him. He wasn't sure if that's what it was, but he definitely was not ready to believe in anything she was saying. He just kind of felt bad for the position she was in. So he listens and he says, look, kind of almost playing along with her. He's like, let's just call it out. If there's something happening in your house, we should call it out. And so he stands up and she's saying, no, don't do that. Don't do that. And he goes, whoever's here, show yourself. And they're looking around, nothing. And I think in a way, Jackie was disappointed that there wasn't, footsteps in the attic right then and there, but there was nothing. And so Al kind of does there's nothing to worry about here. Just stop worrying about it. And so he leaves. And, Jackie's disappointed, but not shocked. And she goes to put something away in the closet. This is immediately after he's left. And she opens this closet, and inside the closet, on every wall, inside the closet, on the back of the door, was written Al. A in red and the L in blue. A-L, all over the wall. And that had not been there before. And what she believes was a response to the challenge by Al. So at this point, if she had money, she said she would have left, but she didn't. She didn't have the resources to move. And so she's just kind of trapped, and she's expressing her concerns and her anxiety to her friend Susan. And the two of them are actually out for a walk in their neighborhood, and she's telling Susan how scared she is and like, what do I even do? And it just so happens that the landlord, her landlord, Jackie's landlord, was walking down the street at the same time, and they bump into each other. They have some pleasantries, and Susan, just kind of without even asking Jackie's permission, says to the landlord, hey, there's some weird stuff happening in our house. She doesn't want to tell anyone because she thinks people will think she's crazy. And so they go into describing to the landlord all the strange happenings in the house, the lights that they got a picture of, the pebbles, the footsteps, all of it. And the landlord is very religious and is very concerned and says, would you allow me to have 2 priests come to your house and check your house out? And Jackie she is a religious person, but to be honest, was a little skeptical at the idea of introducing religion to what was going on. I think that for her, she just wanted it to go away. But then again, she had nowhere to turn. And so she was like, okay, yeah, we'll have the priest come over and check it out. So the next day, these 2 priests show up to her house, and Jackie's house was very much in disarray. She had 2 young kids. She was working multiple jobs, doing school late, and she had all this weirdness happening in her house. And so when they showed up, her house was a total mess. Her kids are crying. It's just, it's a madhouse. And ultimately what happened from this visit is the priest walked around, offered to bless her children. But really they didn't have any sort of like conclusion. And then they leave. And Jackie was like, well, that didn't really do anything for me, but okay. The next day, she gets a visit from Child Protective Services, because the priest had actually filed a complaint saying that this was all a hallucination by an incompetent mother. This notion that the house was haunted, combined with when they showed up, the house was a total mess. They just said, I don't think the kids are safe. And so Child Protective Services gets called, who basically threatened Jackie to like clean it up. Literally clean up your house, but like we're going to be checking in on you to make sure you're a fit mother. And so this is a huge blow, because now Jackie is seeing what happens when you bring up that your house is haunted, right? That this is what can happen. And so now she is not prepared to share this with anybody. So over the next couple of weeks, Jackie brings her kids into the living room and they all start sleeping in the same room. She's increasingly paranoid. She's overworked and she's not sleeping enough, and she's just kind of really spiraling. And, Susan, who's her friend, is really taking a notice, is noticing this. And she also knows the sensitivity of being able to really share this with, authority, because she knows about the Child Protective Services call, and she knows that Jackie is really afraid to share the story with anyone. But she goes over and she tells her, you have to call a paranormal investigator. It is probably the only group of people that if you reach out to them with this story, they're not going to treat you like they're crazy. And if nothing else, that is a reason to call them. Even if what they provide is worthless to you, that it doesn't accomplish anything, they're at least a group of people that are going to take you seriously. And so finally, Jackie just says, okay, let's do it. So a couple days go by and this team shows up at their house, this paranormal investigator team. They have cameras and recorders. I mean, they are in it to try to capture footage. And even though they were ready to listen to Jackie and had obviously taken her seriously enough that they had shown up at her house, they were fairly skeptical. They, by their own admission afterwards, after this whole case had happened, they had said that they had covered over 3,000 cases prior to this and brought their recording equipment and all that, had never once found anything usable that would even hint at the existence of ghosts or the paranormal. And so you could say that they were sympathetic to people that had these experiences, but usually either there was nothing going on or they found a rational explanation for whatever the person was claiming to happen. They didn't have any paranormal footage. So they're interviewing Jackie on camera, the 3 investigators that are there. They're kind of asking her some questions about what's going on and filming it. And Jackie had actually invited her ex-husband, Al, to be there with the kids. So he's in the other room with the kids. And they're interviewing her, and then the power goes out, which it sounds pretty cliche, and I get that. But the power goes off, and then the power comes back on, and it visibly shakes Jackie. she had been living in this house with all these weird occurrences, and it was like she had this feeling that something bad was going to happen. And so she starts acting really, really scared. And she says, you know, I'm telling you, there's something going on with the attic. And so they kind of stop the interview and they're like, all right, let's just go have a look at the attic. We'll go look, there won't be anything there. We'll come back down and we'll chat with her some more. And so one of the three investigators gets a ladder and crawls through this little crawl space into the attic. And so he goes up. And so while he's doing that, Al, who's in the other room with the kids, he's wide awake, laying with his son. He's just like waiting. He's not really expecting anything to happen. And as he's laying there, he could have sworn he heard someone whisper in his ear, "Tell them to get the hell out of here." And he has an interview he does where he describes this moment, and you can tell that Al is as skeptical as they come. And he's like, I just don't know how to explain it. I heard it clear as day. And right after I heard it, I heard a scream from the attic. The guy, the photographer who had gone up into the attic, he was alone up there, and he had brought his expensive camera, and he comes running downstairs or jumps through the hole and practically falls out of the attic. And he tells them, something grabbed my camera. There's no one up there, but something grabbed my camera. And his heart's racing, his face is pale, and the other investigators, they're starting to feel like, what's going on? Al comes bursting out of the room, and he's like, what's going on? And the photographer's like, my camera. And he goes from being scared of what happened to now being like, that's my livelihood. I need to get that camera back. So he goes back up into the attic to retrieve his camera, and he finds the body of the camera in a crate in one side of the attic. And then the lens of the camera had been removed and placed on the other side of the attic. He comes down with his camera, and you can tell that what he's just discovered has really shaken him up. And the other investigators are also very shaken up. And whatever they planned to do that night, whether it was finishing the interview with Jackie or whatever, has now gone out the window. They're ready to leave. Jackie is pleading with them to stay. Al's freaked out. No one knows what's happening. And the investor's like, yep, we're good. We'll be back soon, I promise. But really, they're just like, let's get out of here. And they bolt. After they leave, Al sticks around for a little bit longer, but ultimately has to go back because he has to work early the next day. And so Jackie is left all alone with the kids. She is totally freaked out. She feels like the investigators had upset the entity in the house. And so she's pretty much on edge for something bad to happen. And sure enough, it does. So that night, Jackie is laying on the sofa. She's in full crisis mode. She has no idea what's going on in her house. Watching the investigators who are supposed to be investigating this stuff be obviously spooked and leave really unsettled her. She felt like she didn't have any support from Al. She just felt like the whole situation had just completely fallen apart, and she's so scared for her kids. And she's laying on the sofa, and at some point she must have passed out. And then she wakes up suddenly, and she looks at the foot of her sofa, and she believes she sees what appears to be the figure of an old man standing there looking at her kids. She screams, it vanishes, she grabs her kids, and she runs out of the house. The first people she calls is the investigators, because again, she's worried about telling the police in fear that they would think it was her being crazy and have her kids taken from her. So she calls the investigators, and they don't pick up, but she leaves a voicemail. And on the voicemail, she's completely desperate. She's like, please come back. I am out of the house. I can't go back in. I don't know what to do. Like, I can't go back in. Please help me. And one of the photographers who was there heard the voicemail and decides, you know what? We got to go back. It's super late at night. They find Jackie outside of her property in pajamas with her kids. She's totally freaked out. They bring her inside, and the house is totally calm. There's no sign of anything going on. And so they're kind of walking around the house. No one goes in the attic, but they're just walking around, and it's silent, it's calm. And after a little bit of time, maybe because it was so calm in the house, they decide, you know what, just because, let's go back up into the attic and just, for sanity, let's just take some pictures and video and see what's up there. So two of the investigators go up into the attic. One has a flashlight and a camera, and then the other just has his camera. And so they go up there, and Jackie and the third investigator are kind of anxiously standing at the foot of the attic looking up. And the guys who are up in the attic walking around, they're reporting down to them, we don't see anything, we don't hear anything, it's quiet up here. But like the tension is building, right? And They stop at some point, the two in the attic, and it's just like silence. And all of them reported hearing a snap, and then another snap, and then a third snap, and then silence. And Jackie begins having this overwhelming sense of dread. The guys in the attic are trying to stay calm. They're like kind of trying to talk. And oh, that could have been the roof. Oh, it could have been this. But the investigator who's down below with Jackie and Jackie herself, they start kind of panicking. They're like, hey, come on, come back down. Let's not risk it. Something's about to happen. Come back down. So as they're making their way back over to the exit of the attic, and it's totally pitch black up there, minus whatever light source they had, all of a sudden, one of the investigators just gets yanked backwards into the attic. And it was actually the guy holding the flashlight. And so they hear like a tumbling of the flashlight, a tumbling of the camera, and silence from this other investigator. The other investigator who's up in the attic with him that was not yanked back, he turns around and the guy's gone. And that guy, who has not been yanked suddenly, all he has is his camera. The other guy had the flashlight. So he instinctively starts clicking pictures with his camera to use the flash. Jackie and the guy on the ground, they're screaming, what's going on? And he's just clicking pictures, not looking in the viewfinder, just flashing. And he sees one of the investigator has been hoisted up into the rafters of the attic, and he's been tied to a post, and they have a picture of it. And so they run over, the investigator who's up there with him, he runs over, he unties him, pulls him down, and that guy's, totally freaked out. He doesn't know how he got up there. They collect their stuff and they practically fall out of the attic, and it's just pure mayhem because the guy he's freaked out, he's ashen faced, he's got these marks on his neck like something was holding onto his neck, and they run out of the house, never to go back in. Jackie says that she's not experienced anything paranormal since this instance and swears that this was not a hoax, that in fact this is one of the lowest points of her life, and it made her look like an incompetent mother, and it makes her look crazy, and a lot of people still think she's crazy, and for her this was just a traumatic experience that she has no explanation for. So I'd love to hear what you guys think. If there's a better explanation than ghosts, let me know in the comments. And please be sure to like and subscribe if you've not already. Also, you can check me out on Instagram. My handle's JohnBallen416. And then on TikTok, it's MrBallen as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Talk to you next week. A 1979 New York Times article described her story as being, quote, one of the Western world's most intriguing and convincing cases of reincarnation. I myself am not a huge believer in reincarnation, mostly because any of the stories I've heard, there's no modern day corroboration of fact. But in Dorothy Eady's case, or as she became known, Setti's case, she has a number of things that line up with her story, with her lifelong story, that she in fact was from ancient Egypt and was actually a priestess in ancient Egypt times. And some of her discoveries are pretty incredible. And frankly, Egyptologists and historians that have looked at this case have spent decades trying to prove that she was lying, but can't. She had information that she shouldn't have had that begins to make you wonder, maybe she really was reincarnated. Before we get started, if you could please gently destroy the like button and then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. I'm going to be posting a ton of content just like this as many times a week as I can. I'm aiming for 3, if not 4, every week going forward, so please come along. The too long didn't read version of this story is you have Dorothy Eady, who as a child has a near-death experience. When she kind of comes back, she believes that she is no longer home, that her home is somewhere else. She starts having dreams about this place. She describes this garden and this big building, and then eventually she discovers that what she's describing is a place in ancient Egypt. And she ends up becoming obsessed with ancient Egypt and then begins providing information and helping with archaeological digs that leads to numerous incredible discoveries, all from memories that she claims to have had from her previous life. Even if you don't believe in reincarnation and this whole story seems like totally made up, just listen to how the story flows and then try to make sense of how in the world she had the information she had that led to distinct discoveries that nobody else had made. That they found this stuff as a result of Dorothy Eady's information. How do we reconcile that? It's not impossible, but no one's been able to do it yet. So let's see what you think. Dorothy Eady was born into a lower middle-class family in London in 1904. She was an only child, and she was absolutely adored by her parents. Now, unfortunately, when she was 3 years old, she fell down a flight of stairs in her home and was unconscious. They called the doctor, and the doctor shows up and says she's actually dead. As the parents are talking to the doctor, after about an hour, Dorothy gets up and goes into her bedroom and is like playing on her bed. And the parents come in with the doctor and they can't make any sense of it. And in fact, the parents were furious at the doctor for pronouncing her dead, because they're like, obviously she wasn't. If she's just fine now, like, who are you? What kind of doctor are you? The doctor swears she was dead. Shortly after the accident, Dorothy develops a strange accent that they can't quite place. And doctors and specialists believe that she's suffering from something called foreign accent syndrome, which is fairly common amongst people with significant head injuries. Basically, it alters your speech, and to people that don't know any better, they might think that you just have a strange foreign accent. Dorothy also started telling her parents about this recurring dream she had, where she'd be near this huge building with these big pillars, and she'd be in this beautiful garden. She loved this garden. She talked about the beautiful flowers and her friends that were there, and it was just this unbelievable place. It was like this oasis next to this building. But she didn't know where it was, and she's 3-4 years old, so she's not able to articulate much what this is, but she was just in love with this garden and this location in her dreams, and she talked about it endlessly. Dorothy's mother would find her daughter on her bed either before she went to sleep or when she woke up, crying, because Dorothy longed to actually be in this place in her dreams, which she started calling home. Now, Dorothy's mother would say, but Dorothy, you're home now. And she would say, no, I'm not home. My home is in that garden. It's near that building. And no matter how Dorothy's mother tried to kind of convince her that, no, honey, you live here now. You live here. You've never lived anywhere else. Dorothy was unbelievably convinced that what she was seeing in her dreams was her actual home. It was around this time that Dorothy's parents brought Dorothy to a British museum where they had a big ancient Egyptian exhibit set up. And when they went into the museum, Dorothy sees this exhibit and she's immediately attracted to it. And as she gets closer, she starts seeing the statues of the pharaohs and pictures of the pyramids, and she sprints into the exhibit, runs away from her parents, and she's running to the different statues of the pharaohs and of the Sphinx and all of these different icons from ancient Egypt, and she's kissing their feet and she's sobbing hysterically, and she's yelling, I'm home, I'm with my people. This little tiny kid is having this revelation that she's found home, and she refused to leave the museum. Finally, her parents, get her to calm down. They're pretty embarrassed as people are like looking at them like, what's going on with your child? She finally leaves with her parents. But at this point, now Dorothy has attached that place in her dreams that she longs to go with the beautiful garden. She's attached it to Egypt, to ancient Egypt. And so she becomes completely obsessed with ancient Egypt. Her obsession with ancient Egypt started to get her in trouble. When she'd go to Sunday school, her family is a very, very devout Catholic family. She would compare Catholicism to other ancient Egyptian religions. That got her in a lot of trouble. And in fact, they said, you can't come to Sunday school anymore. Then she got expelled from her Catholic school because she refused to sing a number of the hymns that in some way disparaged ancient Egyptians. She was also told that she could no longer attend Sunday Mass for the same reasons. She was basically not welcome anymore. At 6 years old, Dorothy, who knew how to write and read in English, started to take a keen interest in hieroglyphics, Egyptian hieroglyphics, and she said that they were definitely familiar to her, but she had forgotten how to read it. When she was 7, she was looking through a textbook and she saw a picture of the Temple of Seti I, which is in Abydos, Egypt. And as soon as she saw the picture, it was a big picture of the temple, and then next to it kind of like the broken remains of what looks like maybe a garden of some kind. And she immediately said, that is my home. That's where I'm from. Right there. Temple of Seti I in Abydos, Egypt. That's my home. And as she's looking at the picture and she's looking at those kind of tattered, broken remains, I mean, this is thousands of years old, she's looking at the area next to this big temple in the picture. And she's like, that's the garden, but where are the trees? Where is everything? Why does it look like this? Like, she didn't understand that was thousands of years ago that it was a garden. But she saw the picture and immediately knew it as her home. Also in the textbook was the picture of the pharaoh, Seti I, who the temple was named after. And when she saw the picture of the very well-preserved mummy, she was overcome because she claimed to have known him personally. At age 10, Edie was kind of discovered by world-renowned Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, who offered to teach her how to read and write hieroglyphics, which she picked up almost instantly. Starting at 14, in addition to that recurring dream of the Temple of Seti and the garden right next to the Temple of Seti that she claimed was her home, she started having a recurring nightmare where she, in her former life, was in this subterranean enclosure, and she was being questioned by a high priestess who was demanding that she answered her questions, and when she refused, she was beaten. At 27 years old, Edie meets an Egyptian man and falls in love with him, but also, I'm sure on some level, she was marrying him to secure Egyptian residency, because as soon as they got married, they moved right back to Egypt, where she could be a resident. And actually, when they landed in Egypt, the first thing she did, she's overcome with emotion when she lands, and she starts kissing the ground and crying and saying, I'm home, I'm home. Dorothy and her Egyptian husband have a son, and they name him Seti, just like the pharaoh Seti. Once Edie moved to Egypt, she started, by her account, getting visits from an entity known as Hor-Ra. Now, Hor-Ra, she claimed, was the spirit of the pharaoh Seti I. She would get into these almost trance-like states at night over that first year she was in Egypt. It was like she'd be sleeping, but then she would get up and be in this trance, and she would start frantically writing in hieroglyphics in the middle of the night. And her husband would wake up, and he would see her doing this, and she was like, he couldn't stop her. He couldn't communicate with her. She was just in a trance, recording what she was claiming Hor-Ra was telling her, was dictating to her that she needed to write down. And it was, in fact, about who she used to be. She used to be, according to Hor-Ra, a woman by the name of Ben Trishit, who lived 3,000 years earlier in the time of Pharaoh Seti I, and who lived in the Temple of Seti in and around that garden. So after a year of her going into these trances and writing in hieroglyphics, she had over 70 pages of transcript of what she claims was her story, and it goes like this. Before being born as Dorothy Edie, she was an Egyptian woman named Ben Trishit. Her father was a soldier, and her mother was a vegetable seller who actually died when she was just 3 years old. Unable to care for her, Ben Trishit's father placed her in the temple of Qam el-Sultan. She was then raised at the temple, where she later became a priestess. When she was 12 years old, Ben Trishit was given two choices: either venture out into the world on her own, or become a consecrated virgin and stay at the temple. Ben Trishit decided to take the vows. But a few years later, she meets Pharaoh Seti I, and they end up falling in love, and soon she becomes pregnant. When she is discovered to be pregnant, she was interrogated by the high priest and beaten when she refused to answer, a scene that corresponded to her childhood nightmare. Unwilling to put her beloved Seti through a public scandal, Ben Trishit took her own life. Edie's husband grew increasingly disturbed watching his wife go into these trances and write out the hieroglyphics. I mean, she's amassing all these pages of hieroglyphics. Her whole thing was just too much for him, and so he ultimately filed for divorce in 1936. Following the divorce, Dorothy and her young son leave and go live in another town near the Giza pyramids, and she starts going by the name Seti, which means Mother of Seti. So she doesn't go by Dorothy Edie anymore. And at this point, she also takes a job with Egypt's Department of Antiquities, and she begins a very lengthy and highly successful career in Egyptology. For nearly 20 years, Seti would research almost exclusively the Temple of Seti I and learn everything about not only the temple, but the people who lived there, because It was where she believed she used to live. But it wouldn't be until 1952, when she's almost in her 50s, that she finally actually steps foot in Abydos. And it was because of a job transfer that put her there. And in fact, she took a pay cut to get this job. She was so desperate to just finally step foot in the place that she believed was her old home. As soon as she walked into the temple, the first thing she says is, "It's as if I've lived here before." And she quickly sets up a office in one of the temple rooms and spends almost all of her time there. And she even befriends a cobra and feeds the cobra daily, and just has this cobra friend that just hangs out with her, which no one could make any sense of. Lots of rumors swirled around whether this woman was sane, but because her contributions to Egyptology were so pronounced and so useful, that she was very highly regarded. But of all of her accomplishments, of all of the things that she did, the thing that she is most known for is when she was able, as soon as she got to the Temple of Seti I, identify exactly where the garden was. For Seti, she'd been having dreams of this garden her whole life. And so she very quickly said, if you dig here, you're going to find this garden. And sure enough, they dug down and there was the garden. And in fact, she had described the layout of the garden, what trees were where, what types of trees were there, and it was all confirmed. And once they dug it up, she was also instrumental in identifying where to dig on the north side of the temple, where she said there was a tunnel that ran underneath. It was a secret tunnel. And sure enough, they dug down, there was the tunnel. That was something that they had never seen before. Only she knew about it. And there was no way she would have known about it without prior knowledge. In addition, she also pointed researchers to search in a specific area, in an area known as the Valley of the Kings, for a tomb, a long forgotten tomb. And sure enough, almost exactly where she described, there was in fact a tomb that had never been discovered before. As much as other Egyptologists did not want to accept Seti's claims that she had been reincarnated, and that's why she has all this knowledge, they wanted, frankly, it to be just the ramblings of a crazy person and it to just be some elaborate hoax, but they couldn't deny the fact that she had intimate knowledge of certainly everything that ever happened at the Temple of Seti I in the time frame that she claimed to have been living there 3,000 years prior. Fascinatingly, right before she died, when she was 81, she said that there was a secret underneath the Temple of Seti I. There was a secret chamber, and there was a secret within that secret chamber. But no one's ever gone down there. No one knows where to begin to look. And so without Seti guiding them, it may be one of those things that we'll just never know. So without any sort of rational explanation for how she would have had all this knowledge or understanding of an ancient culture, it leaves skeptics wondering, is this potentially a real case of reincarnation, or is there a better explanation? And I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. In 1947, a disturbing distress signal was sent out kind of in all directions, like a blind distress signal from some point in the Indian Ocean. Numerous American, Dutch, and English ships, along with other international listening stations, heard this distress signal. And once they triangulated where it was coming from, they sent out a search party to go see who needed help. When they arrived on scene, they discovered something that would become one of the most famous maritime mysteries of all time. This is the story of the SS Orang Medan. What's going on, guys? MrBallen here. I was a Navy SEAL for a little while, and now I tell strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. YouTube is my new passion, and I'm going to be posting at least 2 times a week going forward. And if you like this kind of content, please right now hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss any of this stuff. Thank you very much. Before we get into the story, I want you guys to be looking at this through the lens of trying to decipher whether or not you believe this really happened, because there is a large percentage of people that say this is just an urban legend. However, there is a couple details that make it really hard to just write off. Number one, you have a number of international ships and listening stations that all reported hearing this same distress signal, and it's a very unique distress signal that we'll get into. In addition, you have the U.S. Coast Guard in one of their, fairly credible publications published a story about this case 5 years after it happened. And then you have the fact that this case has been around since 1947. It's been 70 plus years and no one's officially debunked it. So let's dive in. In 1947, several Dutch, American, and English ships, along with a number of listening stations, picked up the strange distress signal that was coming from somewhere in the Indian Ocean. The distress signal, which was in Morse code, went like this.
An officer, including the captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge. Possibly whole crew dead.
Then there was a burst of indecipherable Morse code, and then it ended with 2 words.
I die.
Then silence. One ship that heard this distress signal was the Silver Star. It was an American vessel that was kind of patrolling the waterways around the coast of Malaysia. And with the help of other ships in and around the Indian Ocean and some of the listening stations, they were able to triangulate the location of this distress signal. And they pinpointed a ship called the SS Orang Medan that was located right at the end of the Strait of Malacca, which is the primary shipping lane between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so this ship was basically drifting out towards the Indian Ocean. And so the first thing that the Silver Star does is they try to send a message back to the Orang Medan. But after numerous failed attempts, the captain of the Silver Star decides that we need to go investigate because something is obviously not right here. So the Silver Star tells all the other ships in the area, along with the other listening stations, that they are going to be the search party. They're going to reroute and head for the Orang Medan, because at this point, anybody that had heard that signal is saying, like, what do we do? Like, are we going to go investigate? Are you? After a couple of hours of heading straight for the Orang Medan, they see off in the distance the ship. You know, from the eyes of these very experienced sailors on the Silver Star, they knew almost immediately that this ship is dead in the water. It's just drifting, which is not a good sign, especially if you combine that with the signal they got. As they get closer and closer to this ship, it becomes creepier and creepier because they're looking up, and in the bridge where, you know, the steering wheel would be, they can't make any person out. There's no one up there. There's nobody standing on the edge. I mean, they just sent this distress signal. You would think with a ship that's dead in the water that they would be lining the outside of the ship trying to signal someone down. But no, it's just quiet. No one on board, all lights off, just drifting, bobbing in the choppy waters of the Indian Ocean. And so as they get closer, they start blowing their whistle to try to attract anybody on the Orang Medan to signal them back. They're also doing more Morse code to try to get their attention again, not being picked up. And so finally, after all these failed attempts and just the general weirdness around it, the captain of the Silver Star decides, we need to board this ship. So the Silver Star crew members, they knew before they boarded that almost definitely they were going to find something terribly wrong with this ship. There's just too many red flags about it. They were anticipating something bad, but I don't think that they were really prepared for just how bad this was going to be. So they board the ship, and right away on deck is a number of crew members that had passed away. They're all deceased. And the mystery really kicks in the position, the body position of all of the dead crew members. They were all on their back with their hands outstretched in front of them, as if defending themselves from some unseen assailant above them. Even strangers, they had this look of abject terror on their face, as if the final moments before they died were just excruciatingly painful and terrifying. Even the dog was in a position with its teeth bared. It looked like it was growling up into the sky. All of them. And so obviously the Silver Star crew members are, shocked at what they find. And they're kind of looking at each of these dead crew members and they're like, what is going on? So they make their way up to the bridge, and everybody's also dead in the same position, basically fighting with some unseen assailant in their final moments before they pass. The person who had been sending out the distress signal had literally slouched over the telegraph. Like, their finger was literally on the telegraph. He's the only one that was not doing this. He was on the telegraph and had passed away in that position. So they go down into the bowels of the ship. Normally, inside of a steel ship in the boiler room, it's going to be pretty hot. There's no real ventilation to speak of. Not to mention outside, it was over 100 degrees. They went down into the boiler room and down into the ship, and it was strikingly cold. Some of the crew members from the Silver Star said it felt like it might have been about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They found more crew members also passed away, also fighting with something in the air, with that look of abject terror on their face. So all of the crew has perished in this very bizarre way. There was no overt damage to the ship. It just appeared that the engine had been turned off, but ultimately the ship had no real damage to it at all. They couldn't find anything. The crew, despite meeting a fairly unfortunate end, also had no signs of outside injury, external injury. Something had obviously caused them all to perish, but there was no injuries outside their body. In addition, all of them showed signs of rapidly decomposing. Considering they had just been tapping away that distress signal hours earlier, unless the person communicating the distress signal had been the last one alive for a long time, it doesn't really add up that they had decomposed as quickly as they had relative to when this distress signal was sent. So the captain of the Silver Star, taking into account all of the strangeness, decides not to touch any of the bodies, leave them where they are, get off the ship, tie a tow line to the Orang Medan, and tow it in. We're going to have experts look at this and figure out what happened. And so they attach the tow line, the crew members of the Silver Star, and as soon as they begin to move it, they notice, the crew of the Silver Star, that smoke has begun billowing out of the inside of the Orang Medan. And so, not taking any chances, they cut the tow line and they literally jump back onto the Silver Star right as the Orang Medan explodes. In fact, there was a quote which basically said it exploded with so much force that it was lifted out of the water entirely and then splashed back down and rapidly sank. So now you have no evidence. You have the testimony of the people that were on the ship, but other than that, you have no evidence. The ship is now gone. The captain of the Silver Star and his crew just have to go back to the mainland to try to make sense of what they just saw, because you have all these people that were involved and want to know what happened, and they're like, well, let me tell you, we saw this horrible thing on board and then it exploded and it disappeared. And so that's where the mystery kind of ends. But here we go. Let's get into what the primary critique is, because that's important to hear too. And then we'll hear the rebuttal, which I think is also pretty important. So people that believe this story is just a legend will point to the fact that there really isn't a good record of the SS Orang Medan ever existing. There's this one very important publication called Lloyd's Shipping Registers, where you would expect the Orang Medan to be registered, but they're not. Others will say that, well, Orang Medan translates to man of Medan, and Medan is near Sumatra, and that's where they were registered. So they weren't in Lloyd's shipping registers, they were in another registry. But either way, there is contention around whether or not this ship ever existed. But for those who say that this could be true, they say that, well, there's a good reason why those records don't exist, because someone's trying to cover it up. According to a German researcher who had spent decades covering the Orang Medan case, he published in the Death Ship on the South Seas, it's a publication from 1953, that the Orang Medan was transporting illegal materials, things like nitroglycerin and potassium cyanide. These are things used to create weapons. And there might have been a leak that led to the death of everyone on board. No physical injuries, but they passed away. And then also, after they tied that tow line, the materials could have detonated. Perhaps they detonated, that kind of thing. And so that still leads some questions, right? I mean, then how did the Silver Star crew not also get exposed to these chemicals as soon as they got there? Either way, it's a fascinating story, and I hope that you took something.